Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Bean Studios. I'm live here with John Brabant. John is a lobbyist in Montpelier for Vermonters for a Clean Environment. John, thank you so much for coming down here today.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I'm the Regulatory Affairs Director at
Ah,
Vermonters for a Clean Environment, so I
well,
do more than just lobby. But
you didn't tell me that.
okay, well, that's why I'm here to fill in the background.
Well, I thank you very much for coming down here today. For anyone who knows me, knows that I try to kind of like to stick to I try to be diligent about my scheduling. But John and I kind of made a plan to do this last week, and I may or may not have forgot about it. And John was here waiting for me this morning, so I had to rush on over and come get set up. So I can't thank you enough for sticking
Yeah,
around.
no, I had a great time talking with your Uncle Jerry and going over the history of the Bean Chevrolet property, which originally was a dairy farm
That's right.
that raised Holsteins, milked Holsteins. So that's a little side interest of mine, farming, which I do a little bit of. So
Well, I know that this is not the first time that you've been here, down here at the
that's
old Bean
correct.
Chevrolet
Yeah,
building. There's a little
that's
bit of
right.
a history, and I'll just quick give a brief synopsis. But you were actually here that day. So back in the day, we used to have a Texaco gas station. They got the gas station back in I think the early 30s or late 20s because my great great uncle was the first person to own a tractor in Northfield. So they said, you know what, that's going to take a lot of gas, and so they got some gas tanks through Texaco, and they started selling the gas because turns out other people needed it. And of course, that just continued to become more and more prevalent. But in the late 80s, they decided they had kind of had enough of selling gas. And you were actually here that day to come
Well,
help take the tanks
yeah,
out.
and this is a little bit of conjecture, but a number of, well, the tanks were generally owned by, in this case, Texaco, by the fuel distributors, and they were single-walled tanks, steel tanks that had one wall, one barrier, and to the environment. And over time, steel, particularly in the subsurface environment, will rust, and they leaked gasoline. And so new standards were put in place by the legislature. Actually, ANR, Agency of Natural Resources, operates under what they call a delegation agreement with the EPA. And so they're delegated authority to enforce the minimum federal standards for air, air and water supplies and streams and lake water quality and hazardous waste and materials. And so, being a delegated state, as Vermont is, they had a program, a new program, brand new program that I got hired into in 1988 to oversee the management of gasoline at gas and petroleum products at filling stations and distribution centers. And there was a requirement that was enacted pretty much across the country that at the federal level and then overseen by this at the state level in delegated states to remove these single-walled fuel tanks, fuel storage tanks. So they had to be replaced with these double-walled systems, and they were pretty costly. And there's an attendant liability. And so the fuel distributors, which own these tanks, and the associated liability were they to leak, um, they would look at the volume of throughput of fuel sold, and they would decide whether or not they would want to fund the installation, not only the removal, but the installation of new tanks. And I would conjecture that they didn't sell enough volume here to make it worth Texaco's while.
I see.
Likely offered your relatives the opportunity to put tanks in. They might have even had a contractor lined up and they would continue to fill them, but you would have to then own the tanks, take on the liability, and fund a substantial portion, if not all, of the installation costs. So many small uh, convenience stores, country stores, pulled their tanks and stopped pumping gas.
Interesting. See, that's kind of the side of the story that I've kind of been told, but never really understood because I just there it was like, they basically always made it seem like we just got sick of doing it, which I'm sure was kind of true too. And then when they come along and say, well, it's actually going to cost you more money and you're going to be liable in case there is a leak and et cetera, they're probably like, let's just focus on selling
It's not
cars.
too different than what happened in the '60s with the requirement for bulk tanks
Okay.
and downstairs milking pollers on cement milking pollers on dairy farms, which used to have the milking pollers upstairs on wood floors, and so it became a sanitation issue,
Okay.
allegedly. And then they went from the milk cans into bulk tanks, and so when they required that, when the creameries, the processors, dairy processors, started requiring that, many little family farms went out. They would milk, 8, 10 cows, sometimes less, for pocket change, a little side money.
Sure.
Um, and in diversified farms is what typified Vermont hill farms, and
Sure.
that diversification increasingly kind of got peeled away and diminished, and we lost all those farms.
Yeah, well, you
Um,
say allegedly. I would be curious to know what you mean by that.
Allegedly,
Well, you said that like it's became a sanitation issue allegedly,
well,
and like I see this. It seems even now like a lot of the decision making in government is almost geared towards like snuffing out the smaller sides of business.
I think I don't think it's always intentional, but
I
it's
agree with that.
nevertheless the effect. Like, so we've
True.
talked about fuel tanks, we talked about bulk tanks. Um, when I said allegedly, it's probably I got a little bit of a bias
Yeah.
about overregulation, even though some people accuse me of being a zealous regulator. We can talk about that when I was a regulator at A&R. But I was always fair and even-handed. But so, like with on-farm slaughter, which is now legal, I mean, our Vermont Agency of Agriculture fought tooth and nail against that. They they used to allow unpasteurized milk to be sold, raw milk, and then they had an outbreak of listeria from some raw milk cheese sold at Shelburne Farms.
Okay.
One incident, but that became the pretext that they used to get it banned, the sale of raw milk. It's now allowed again. It's more strictly managed, but there is, a continuous effort, at least pressure, to eliminate on-farm slaughter and, raw milk sales. But if you look into the history of, you know, foodborne illness,
Sure.
um, there's almost no case. In fact, I don't know of any case where a beef animal, for instance, slaughtered on a farm and then sold to the neighborhood resulted in an outbreak of, you name the disease. But every outbreak has been from big meat processing facilities, Hormel being one, I think, and there may have been some others that just escaped me. But that's where you see it because they're just moving, 100,000
Sure.
head through a day to slaughter, and there's one inspector for that whole immense operation. And the inspectors get comfy. They're required under federal law to provide an office, little office for them. It has to meet certain standards. They have to have a desk and a computer access and all this stuff. So these guys, they go to the office for 30 years at the same facility. So they work for the feds. They're getting paid by the feds, but their kind of work community is the slaughterhouse management and the workers. So they wind up kind of their not integrity, but their objectivity gets somewhat compromised,
Well,
generally speaking.
and thinking from a brain like mine, where I'm always thinking like this, and it's unfortunate that I am. I don't know anything about the farming industry or like the meat industry. I know a little bit about it, of course, but like when it comes to the raw milk thing, when it comes to the factory farming, it seems like there's tons of issues and problems with like the large scale of agriculture. Like if you're
Yeah.
doing large scale farming, for example, with beef cattle or pigs, whatever it is, I can't help but to wonder if there's the lobbyists and there's certain interests and industries that are behind a lot of the legislation that makes it a little bit more difficult to do it at a smaller scale. And you can tell me if I'm wrong. I really have no idea, but
Well,
that seems to be, from my perspective, what the case is.
yeah, and I can't provide you an anecdote, unfortunately,
That's fine.
at least off the top of my head of where that as a case in point of where that has happened in my experience. But in terms of when you consolidate any industry, when you have fewer and fewer, they become too big to fail.
That's right.
Like the banks, we saw
Sure.
that awful, I think, awful bank bailout, and at the expense of the we people, us.
You're
Um,
talking about 2008.
yeah,
Okay.
and right through 2010, Peter Welch was in there. I know this because I had a conversation with him about this, but it becomes a problem. And like, here's an example where they become too big to fail. They're they allow glyphosate to be. I'm going way off tangent
That's
here,
totally all
but
right. That's
they
the whole
allow
point.
glyphosate is used. It's a weed killer, and Monsanto developed these genetically modified strains of corn and soybean, to name two that I know of uh, grain crops that are used to feed among beef and dairy. And so they spray might be a grassy hayfield, and it kills every with glyphosate, also known as Roundup, and it intentionally killing off all the what do they call that, broadleaf plants,
Sure.
grasses, etc. And then they plant corn, and they use corn drills now. They don't till, they call it no till. So this is why it's environmentally friendly or marketed as such, because they're not disturbing the soil, and the root structure from the what was previously a grassy field stays in place and holds the soil in place. So then they plant the corn seed, and the corn is genetically modified to be unaffected by the herbicide that is still in the soil. But it always kind of boggled my mind that, wait a minute, so a conventional plant, how would it die from glyphosate? It would uptake the pesticide, the herbicide, and it would have this effect on its cell operation, and it would kill it. Well, that genetically modified corn that is resistant to the herbicide is also taking in the glyphosate, incorporating it in its plant structure, but is unaffected by it. So then it grows to the point of harvest. It gets chopped into feed or whatever and fed to dairy cows. Does that glyphosate then end up in the cow and in its milk? And the position of EPA and industry was that, well, to the extent it does, it's not at a level that's of any concern. So EPA set a level based on testing done by the industry. The EPA used to have its own, you know, uh, labs, in-house labs, and even contract labs that worked for them to act as a check and balance on industry's testing to ensure that their results are the same.
Sure.
And that's fallen away. They've gotten rid of that. So they just industry signs an affidavit that says, "Oh, we're telling the truth." And and not to go too far down this path, but what happened was there was a class at some college, I can't remember, where they're talking about this, and they got into this discussion, and the students and the professor said, "Yeah, it gets up in the plant, and the plant doesn't die," and they're like, "But it's in the plant, and the cattle eat it, the hogs eat it. Doesn't that then get in them, and doesn't it get in the milk?" And so I said, "Let's go and sample." So they went to various grocery stores, grabbed gallons of milk, and ran it to the lab, and they found in many cases, 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10 cases, that the levels of glyphosate in the milk product that was on the grocery store shelf exceeded federal standards for what was considered safe for human consumption. So, what should have happened, and this was under Obama, you know, the lefty.
Yeah.
This is why I don't buy left right. It's
Yeah.
all nonsense.
We
They
should
all do
talk
the
more
same
about that
thing.
too.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
should.
Yeah.
So Obama tried to initiate an emergency rule change. So ram a change in a regulation to increase the level of what would be considered contamination by glyphosate of milk and dairy products to and it wouldn't be health based. It would now be politically
Mm.
motivated to allow for this milk to continue to be sold. Now, if you or I, Paul, were to sell a product that exceeded those standards and were found on the shelf, there would be guys with, bulletproof vests and SWAT team machine guns um, at hand, shutting us down, taking us to court, and dragging us through the process and crushing us. But because of the industry and who they are, both the chemical industry and the mega farms and who would be affected, they didn't even tell the public. There was no public announcement, don't buy this batch or drink this milk. It was quiet, and it was the actions of consumer advocacy organizations that found out about this and brought this to the fore and forced the rule change or made public that there was an emergency rule change in play. Obama gets he's in his second term. There's millions of public comments against this change, and so he stops the process. He doesn't disband it. He stays the emergency rule process, leaves it on the table, and so then Trump, who's the bad guy, right? I don't know what he did. I think they pushed it through. But if Obama was so concerned about public health and the environment and such a lefty, Wall Street lefty, I don't know how you can be both, uh, he would have stopped the process, and that would have at least slowed down the next administration from moving through that change. I believe it passed, and I mean it was finalized, and so now there are allowed to be higher levels of glyphosate in your milk.
And glyphosate, doesn't it cause
Glyphosate.
cancer?
It's linked to
Cancerous?
cancer and all sorts of. I'm not an expert on it. It's just not healthful. And now it's been found out. So there's what is called on-label use for pesticides and off-label. There's a label. They call it that because the drums or the container you buy the pesticide in, the herbicide, the whatever, it needs to be used only in accordance with the prescribed directives on those labels. And these quantities applied with these types of tools, machinery, etc. And anything that's not allowed or provided for on that label is an illegal use. So, an on-label use of glyphosate is to spray it on what you want to be a cornfield or soybean field, plant your
Sure.
genetically modified crop, and then harvest that. Well, wheat farmers have had increasingly difficult harvests out in the Midwest, and the wheat's grown in the mid and western states, more to the north, up by the Canadian border and up into Canada, and they're having difficulty getting their matured wheat product harvested before it gets too wet and things start molding, and farmers have lost their shirts because once you get mold on it, you throw the whole crop away.
Sure.
And so somebody cooked up this idea that if you spray the plant, the wheat plant, again, this is not an on-label use, with glyphosate, it kills the plant and causes that seed head to mature rapidly. But now you have direct application, not on the ground and then taken up in the plant at a lesser, more diffuse level, but you have a direct application of a glyphosate on the plant that is then harvested and ground into flour and then goes in our bread. And EPA was notified about this. The farmers denied it. The growers denied it. It was all documented, and now they've kind of gone quiet. And it's another case where EPA has turned a blind eye. First under Trump, but it continues under Biden. So there should have been, again, the SWAT team they would have dispatched for you and me, Paul,
Sure.
out there. But instead, they work day and night to keep this from the public knowledge.
So, as you might see, I have a few books above me here. I don't know if you know who Chelsea Green Publishers are.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So Ian
Yeah.
Baldwin, a lot of these belong to him, and he's given them to me.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most important lessons I can say that I've ever learned from Ian or Rob Williams, for that matter, about the EPA is that it almost seems to be that they use the EPA as like a regulatory function to get away with a lot of destroying the environment. And maybe you tell me I'm wrong about that.
No, I think.
But that's something they've told me.
Most regulatory agencies across the country, and this is sacrilege, but have been compromised.
Yeah.
They're captured, just like our legislature, and we can talk about that today.
Yeah, so definitely we should talk about that. I just want to, before we go there, um, let's talk a little bit about your, so you were here as a state employee to right here in Northfield to come check out this removal of a gas tank.
1988.
1988.
Yeah.
So that's, I want to just make this very clear. John has institutional knowledge of this state and some of before we dive in on on the state, he has been doing this for a long time. Really, I guess nearly 40 years, right? I mean, it was
Well,
it 30?
I worked as a hydrogeologist since 1983,
Okay.
off and on. I was also an auto mechanic, so I have
Oh, really?
a place near and dear in my heart for being Chevrolet. I was a Volvo mechanic
Okay.
at one point, and was started out as a shade tree mechanic, and I was able to get a job at a Volvo dealership and did that. But I came to Vermont when the company I worked for out of the greater Boston area was looking to open an office. Actually, they were looking toward Plattsburgh and then maybe in the off chance Vermont, but we had a job over at Plattsburgh Air Base to clean up the mess there. There was methylene chloride, and that's a whole nother ugly story. I won't go into that depth, but my buddy Pete Murray and I came up here scouting around for an office space. I had never been to Burlington, Vermont. I'd been to Plattsburgh. My sister attended college there, and I thumbed across the Adirondacks from Oswego State, where I attended college for a few years, to Plattsburgh, but never having been to Burlington, which was a place across the lake that I could see from Plattsburgh. So my friend Pete and I, in the evening after looking around and getting listings, it's before the internet, newspaper listings from the local rags, and circling them and calling them and setting up, meetups to look at office space. We went across on the ferry boat to Burlington, and Pete called it Girlington, and now it's common phraseology, I guess. But it was pretty obvious why he called it that.
Oh, yeah.
And amazing. And so we went from Plattsburgh, which was a little bit beat up kind of town at the time, was rough, and came to Burlington. It was a shining city on the lake and beautiful place. And Pete's like, this is where we should set up an office. So right or wrong, we went looking around here and signed a contract, which we weren't authorized to do, and but we did it so we didn't have to work in Plattsburgh. And that's how I came here, and I worked on cleanup projects, hazardous waste cleanup sites down in Massachusetts, W.R. Grace site. There's a movie out there you can watch, John Travolta, Civil Action.
Okay.
A Civil Action, based on the book. And that's the site I worked on. It was a really polluted site with chlorinated organics. But
Where was that again? I'm sorry.
In Woburn, Mass.
Okay, Woburn, Mass.
Woburn, Woburn.
Okay.
And then I worked on a number of sites, but with the consulting firm I was an employee at. But we came up here, opened an office, and we did mostly cleanup of leaking gasoline tanks at filling stations, and we had technologies that were proprietary, and so we had the corner of the market. But I came to know folks at the state, and I wasn't very happy with what my company did, because they would be hired by the polluter. Not that they were intentionally polluting. These were just sometimes mom and pop, sometimes big petroleum companies. But we tended to be more advocate than neutral observer, and it became a problem for me. Actually, when the team of lawyers, when I was down in Massachusetts, wanted me to tell lies of omission on the stand, they were setting me up for testimony, and I didn't like that. So eventually I was able to secure a job, albeit a temporary position with the state, starting in May of 1988, and that's how I found my way to being Chevrolet, because I would inspect what we called tank pulls, when they pull those single wall tanks out of the ground, and I would inspect the excavated hole, as we called it, and we had these meters, and we'd monitor for volatile organic compounds.
Okay.
And decide whether to put a place on the sites list or not. So
And how long did you do that for?
I didn't. Well, I worked in the consulting field for a year in Vermont, and then, or just shy of a year, and then I worked for the state in that capacity for May of '88 to August of '89, and then I transferred and took a job with the solid waste management division in the same Department of Environmental Conservation, and I'd spent more of my time there throughout my career. Yep.
Okay, so take me from there.
Mm-hmm.
How do you end up working in the legislature or being in the state house? And I'm not
Okay.
maybe not necessarily
Well,
working in the
yeah.
legislature.
Well,
But
it wasn't that I had any plans, so I was just, like anyone else. I came, they interview you, and they said, "This is your job." It's funny. They were all very focused on my credentials as a hydrogeologist with all that experience. That was like definitely what got me the job. First a temporary and then the permanent job. But I did very little of that. And increasingly, when I would check or challenge, work done by consulting firms, it became a problem for mid-level management. Like, well, no, that's not what we do. And then be like, well, there's a problem with this data, or there's a problem with their methodology. And so I started learning about bureaucracies and how there tends to be I don't know, a behavior that the employees don't really want to make the effort. So they find out ways to do the least amount of work within their 8-hour day. And when the 8 hours has been put in, they get the heck out of Dodge. And I would work to 7, 8 o'clock at night, because to do your job, sometimes you had to, like in the consulting world, you had to stay longer some days, and some days you get out early. And that's not the rhythm of the state bureaucracy.
no.
You show up at 8 and you leave at 4:30. You get a half hour for lunch. Boom, boom, boom. Phone's ringing as you're walking out of your office. You don't pick it up.
No, well,
And
there's
that
no
always bothered
incentive
me.
to.
Pardon me?
There's no incentive to.
Yeah, well, there should be. Your commitment
Public service.
to public service
Yep.
and protecting the environment, right?
Of course.
All these people got environmental degrees. Many of the people that were hired into my agency, people my age at the time, came from UVM, and they went through the environmental programs. They got master's degrees, and they're supposed to be committed to environmental protection, and they weren't as committed as I would have liked them to be. So I was tasked. My job when I worked for the solid waste division became one of permit writer, and I did field compliance. And so there was a point in time where there was a trash incinerator that had been built in the 80s by a company called Wheelabrator out of New Jersey in Rutland, in the valley, right along the railroad tracks. And why did that come to Rutland? Well, Governor Madeline Kunin was very interested, like every governor, in seeing Vermont, the Vermont economy built up. And, so she thought that maybe she could bring in outside money like they all do. At the time, it wasn't China.
Sure.
It wasn't South Korea. It wasn't the countries that now are the kind of leaders in, developing countries that are leading in the markets, and the banks, Thailand and whatnot. Though they weren't so prominent back in the 80s. It was Japan and Germany.
Yeah.
They were they were making money hand over fist. And so what did they do? They, like China's doing now, they're investing their money around the world. So
Sure.
Kunin, through her connections, had the International Bank of Japan, reached out to Japanese government, and the government, joined at the hip with the International Bank of Japan, IBJ, came over here, and they brought an entourage, and I don't know if they still have the governor's plane, but up on the plane they went, and they flew over Vermont, and she was selling Vermont to these investors, to these companies that were working through the IBJ. And so then what do? They go back to their offices in Japan, and they look at where are the growth industries, and they're like, wow, trash, turning waste to energy. It was this miraculous thing. They would they change the name from trash incinerators to waste to energy, and there's this green technology. Sound familiar, Paul?
Oh, yes.
We'll get into that.
Yeah.
These green miracles. And so that was a new green miracle. And because Vermont was a green state, they said, Governor Kunin, we'd like to build a waste-to-energy plant, modern waste-to-energy plant in your state so you can be cutting edge on this methodology that turns something that is despoiling our landscape with landfills in every town like Vermont used to have.
That's right.
And instead we put it in this little box and this magic thing, and out comes electricity, and we have pollution controls, and the waste goes away. Well, I forgot to mention there's this ash that's a byproduct of that.
Sounds about right.
Super toxic. It's actually tests. If you run it through the EPA test methodologies, it tests as hazardous waste.
What is it called? Is there a name for it? What's left after?
Incinerator ash.
Just incinerate. Okay, I was just curious.
Bottom ash and fly ash.
Well, fly ash is what I was more.
Fly ash is what goes up, gets caught by the electrostatic precipitators, the pollution controls.
Yes.
And then bottom ash is the stuff that falls through the grates on the bottom.
The precipitators are like they call them clean coal. When they're burning coal, they use those to scrub the
scrubbers.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure.
Well, they use electrostatic precipitators to grab the particulate matter.
Okay.
They actually have electrical charge going through this grate and this netting, and it causes the particulates to fall out of the column, going out the smokestack, and then they spray actually a solution of water and calcium carbonate in solution into that, and that becomes the oh my God, I just had a mental block. The scrubber. That's the scrubber, and that's it's designed to grab sulfur dioxide, but it also grabs a lot of other stuff, some mercury, uranium, and there's a lot of contaminants that come out.
Serious pollutants.
Serious pollutants. That's what causes acid rain here to sulfur.
That's right.
Sulfuric acid, that's the result of the sulfur dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere. It mixes with rainwater and turns into sulfuric acid, and that's what's killed the lakes in Maine and New Hampshire and the Adirondacks. And we've been somewhat spared because we have heavily buffered soils, but over in Groton, whereas a granitic bedrock, it's not so buffered. So
okay. Well, anyway, I didn't want to take away off track, but interesting. It's just interesting because I just think it's really important that we touch on this, because when we talk about pollution, I think a lot of the conversation around pollutants right now is focused on one thing, which is the carbon emissions thing, which sure, fine, but what we're talking about has always been known as pollutants, and it has been for a long time, decades.
And the Vermont environmental organizations were focused on all those media, the air, surface water, groundwater, the threats to that, and farmland and forest land and habitat. Those were their foci. And now, if you look at where the money is and where the lobbyists for these, I now put them in quotations, environmental organizations are focused, like 99% of their focus is dealing with climate change.
Yeah.
And they have myriad excuses for that, but the real reason is you just look at who populates their boards. It's the new green industry, like the it's for the 80s, and they were to have allowed themselves to be compromised as they have now. They would have had Wheelabrator and all these waste energy plant people on their boards.
But they didn't. Oh
no, that was sacrilege.
People knew better.
They were very concerned. It was conflict of interest was huge. They were so sensitive to anybody, even viewing them as having a conflict of interest, particularly with industry. It was a big deal.
I'm sure.
And now they've just ripped up those guidelines, those policies, and they've redefined conflict of interest, or they don't discuss it. They will not discuss it, or they'll get very angry if you try to discuss it. So I was tasked with. So Wheelabrator built this trash incinerator, I call it, waste to energy plant in Rutland, and well, guess what? They didn't realize, Kunin administration didn't realize what they had invited into town. They built this thing in this valley that in the winter has what they call temperature inversions. So they have this, basically you have cold air that sits atop warm air. And so cold air is denser. So when the smokestacks, when the car exhaust, when the wood stoves, we had these vigilant wood stoves without any catalytic converter technology on them, it would just puke into the air. If you came into the Rutland Valley, coming from like Killington, Route 4, you'd look down and it would be this like layer. It was amazing how stratified it was. and you'd see down below this black layer because the smoke would rise up and hit the cold air and sit there.
Yeah.
And it would be like black and yellow. It looked like LA.
Yeah.
And then above it would be clear. And so where do the people live and breathe? The little children, they're
Sure.
down there. And all these emissions, and trash incinerators emit dioxins, hydrofurans, lead, mercury, uranium, radioisotopes. The diaper that the guy who has, say cancer, and they run these radioisotopes through their body so they can do tracer analysis to see where the cancers are. It allows them to light up. And so they have these radioisotopes that they then go in their diaper, and the diapers get tossed in the trash truck, which then get delivered to the incinerator. And these are, they're metals, they're radioactive metals, and those isotopes, and then they go to the incinerator. You can't break down an element. The element is elemental. That's as far as you can break it down.
So it's not going anywhere.
So it's not going anywhere. So they emit radioisotopes into the atmosphere. So I was charged with re-permitting this thing because this incinerator had run for a few years, but Wheelabrator went belly up. And, of course, like we always do, like they're doing with green energy, the state was so hot under the Coonan administration to get this industry to come here. They're like, well, what can you do to incentivize us? Got any public money?
Sure.
Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And so we have Vermont Industrial Development Agency. I think they're still around. I'm not sure, but its acronym was VITA.
Yeah.
And they gave a massive loan.
They're still around.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was if memory serves me right, like $26 million, which back then was crazy money.
Would be today even to some degree.
Yeah. That would be like 80 million now or 100 million. But
sure.
So they were given this loan. Wheelabrator was given this loan, and then Wheelabrator went bankrupt, and so the state went to bankruptcy court, the Attorney General's office, and on behalf of VITA, and VITA wound up having an option, I guess, on this plant. I don't think they actually owned it. It was in this proceeding, the federal bankruptcy court, and there were business people in Rutland that were friendly with Snelling, who had been governor.
That's right.
And I'll never forget, and this is probably a good anecdote for your viewers and those folks listening. There used to be this radio show on DEV called The Rod Clark Show. And I remember listening to it. I was in the car a lot for my state job. And I was listening to Rod Clark, and he had former Governor Snelling on. And they were talking about the state of the state and Coonan administration, and he had nothing good to say about Governor Coonan. I think she did a lot of good stuff for the environment, but he was actually, by today's standards, they'd call him a radical lefty environmental.
They would.
Yeah. Oh yeah. He cared about Vermont.
Republican, or no?
Yeah. This is when Republicans. Clean Air Act was passed by Republicans.
Sure.
Nixon created the EPA cabinet level agency.
Sure.
Republican.
So it doesn't matter.
That whole thing with the splitting, where industry now supports generally the Republican Party, not always. Now they support both parties.
Yeah.
Whoever they pass their money to both. But the Republican agenda shifted over time against environmental regulation, and we could talk about that maybe later. But Snelling. I remember very clearly him talking about how Coonan increased the size of state government X-fold by this many employees, and he was pointing his finger at Agency of Natural Resources, being by way of example. And I thought that was it was right, but the characterization was that she's this big spender. Well, the money that was being spent to run that agency, depending on the program, it was a 10% or a 5% match by the state to 90 to 95% EPA grant money to run those programs. So it was an infusion of money into the state.
So it didn't matter.
So I think they hired like 50 new people in A&R. Well, it didn't matter. It actually, it created it brought young people here, gave jobs to people graduated from UVM, so they didn't leave the state.
Sure.
They got jobs here. There were many engineers who were involved in the building of the interstate. They came to work at A&R. with their engineering degrees to build sewage plants and all that, wastewater treatment facilities, water treatment facilities. And then what? So what do you do when you have people working in the state, particularly back then before the internet? They take their paycheck and they go to the food store in town. They go to the clothing store in town. They go to the Bean Chevrolet and buy a Chevrolet. And so that money was a direct infusion into our economy. And so I think it was an unfair, not being an overt fan of Kunin, there's a lot I can say about that I'm not happy with her about, but she did a lot of good, and her administration did amazing stuff for the environment, for Vermont. And so Snelling was griping about this and that, and eventually Rod Clark, this radio personality who had this show on DEV, said, well, Governor Snelling, maybe you have such serious grievances. It sounds like all that stuff sewn together would be perfect for a campaign speech. And he's like, maybe you should consider running. He goes, oh, no, I'm not going to run. And they had this back and forth throughout the conversation. And by the end of it, he said, you know what, Rod? You've convinced me. I'm going to run. And that made, back when we had a free press, Times Argus, Rutland Herald, Burlington Free Press, there and a lot of smaller rags around the state, the Randolph Herald, the Valley Reporter, all these papers, front page headlines, Governor Snelling announces he's going to run against Madeline Kunin. When Kunin heard that, she said, oh, I don't think I'm going to run. Because she knew she'd get spanked. It's like why the Dems don't run against Phil Scott.
Yeah.
They don't want the embarrassment. So they just, anyone, you want to run, go ahead. We're going to be, our support of you is going to be tepid.
But Snelling he had that much of a...
Oh, yeah, he was very well respected. He was a good governor, and he was a huge defender of Act 250.
Really?
Big defender of Act 250, absolutely. When people would come to him, reportedly, to his office, I heard this through assistant attorney generals who I would work with on enforcement cases. We'd talk about Act 250 because a lot of times there'd be overlap. A landfill might have an Act 250 permit and an A&R permit that I would have written, and if there were violations, there would be violations of both. If you're a violation of an an A&R permit or permits, you would then, by extension, be in violation of the Act 250 permit, because Act 250 permits incorporate all the other regulatory permits at the state level as conditions of those permits. So
I see.
They were collateral violations of Act 250. So I would have these conversations about, Act 250, and I would hear about Governor Snelling. Some industry or some developer would be complaining, oh, I'm a good guy and they're making me out to be this villain. And Snelling said, and they'd get a meeting with the governor, and he'd say, okay, so what's the issue? And I got this assistant AG here with me to kind of go over this with you. And Snelling would be like, you're in the wrong place. You need to get into compliance. This is a good law. No, I'm not going to go to legislature and gut this law.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Snelling runs, gets elected. Wheelbrader's in bankruptcy. The stuff's in play with VITA and the bankruptcy court and the Attorney General's office representing the state in that effort, and VITA, an arm of the state. And there were promises made to these developers. Well, if you buy that incinerator, I'll help you get it permitted, because it had been previously permitted, and it shouldn't be an issue. So they bought this thing that cost, based on memory, like $26 million. That VITA had $26 million in for $2.5 million. And they didn't even pay it all up front. It was like there was a first payment to take ownership, and then VITA would float them a loan for the balance, and then the second payment would come in when they got it up and running, all their permits, and it got fired up and running. So there's that incentive again. Conflict. State wants to get some of its money back. There's pressure from VITA. The Governor Snelling reportedly made some promises. It was about revitalizing the Rutland economy, et cetera, et cetera. They built it on a rail line with the eye toward bringing trash up from Albany and even New York City to dump in a green state, burn here. The problem, one of the major problems with the incinerator when it was run by Wheelabrator was they needed a place to dump the ash, which is now super toxic. EPA came up with this idea. Their staff cooked up this idea to blind eye incinerator ash in terms of its hazardous waste, it meeting that definition of a hazardous waste, and they wrote an exemption not even by rule, because they couldn't get it through regulation.
They just said
They just wrote a policy. We're going to interpret, despite whatever the testing. If you tested, John and Paul's discharge, and it tested lower than that, but still at the hazardous level for whatever constituents
they're in
are
trouble.
in it. Again, the guys with the flak jackets and the guns would be not quite. They'd be
Pretty
writing
much.
letters, certified letters to us. But with these guys, because many of these, this was marketed as the green solution, like so many things. Everyone latched onto it. People were desperate to close these polluting landfills. They were all unlined. And so they latched onto us. Many municipalities, like Chicago and big communities, bought these things, built these things. Some directly operated, some subcontracted their operation, but they were heavily invested in this. And they had all this ash, which was super hazardous and it would take constituents that might be in plastic, for instance, that are not water soluble, but by burning them, you'd create these metal salts, which were soluble in water. So it made them, uber transmissible in the environment, the subsurface environment. So if these ash landfills leaked leachate, or if you had to treat the leachate, this stuff was super problematic. So
leachate is basically what, like
it's the rainwater that
mixed
percolates,
with
percolates through the waste mass, in this case an ash landfill, and it leaches out, called leachate, because it pulls these constituents that are water soluble into the water that's flowing through, comes in clean, comes out nasty at the bottom. And so they put liners under these landfills, and then they collect that liquid, and it goes to treatment. And that's a whole nother conversation you might want to talk to James Ellers about, but we can discuss that too if you got time.
Well, we got plenty of time. See, that's what's lovely about a podcast is we can go as long as we like.
Okay.
And people will tune in or they won't.
Okay.
I just want to say quickly before we keep going, I do have a comment. Put sound check on the list. Somebody complaining about the sound. I hope that I fixed the problem. Please let me know. If not, I think it should be good, but they can hear, but it might be a little bit quiet. So let me know, guys, if that's still a problem. Yeah, I've turned everything up, and I've also turned your mic up the most. But if it's still a problem, please let me know.
And if there's anything that I covered that you didn't quite hear, ask the question, and I'll be happy to go back over it.
Absolutely, and we can do that. But I want to keep in the direction that we're going. So the trash incinerator in Rutland. This was, I know, what can we just recap quickly? What years was this when you were?
So Wheelabrator built it, I believe, in 85, 86, right around in that period. They only ran for a couple years. I think they shut down in 88 when I started. It was right around the time I started. There was a lot of turmoil over this.
Okay.
And as you might expect, because there were contracts to it from solid waste districts to have waste. All of a sudden, there was no place. Where do we redirect the solid waste? It was at the same time they were trying to close online landfills. There was another, like, double-walled tanks.
Yeah.
They were really focused. And the environmental community, I didn't need to put quotations around them then. They were the environmental community, and they were pushing through regulations at the state legislature to augment groundwater, surface water, air protections. Which is good that we're talking about that now. So there were promises made, these entrepreneurs. I'm leaving names out because that's not where I want to go on that.
I hear you. I completely understand.
There are some of these people, these business people I have a huge amount of respect for. They wanted to do the right thing too, and I thought this was a good way, kind of like people going into wind industry or solar. They think initially it's the right thing, and when they realize, or maybe fail to realize it, they've headed down the wrong path and there's an uproar. They take it very personally, and it becomes this conflict, which is what we're seeing now with renewable energy. Yep. Same thing, So they were saying they were selling themselves as environmentalists, and CUNY probably thought she was an environmentalist being environmentally sensitive by bringing them here, courting International Bank of Japan and Wheelabrator to build this jalopy in Rutland. So that thing was puking all these hazardous air contaminants into the atmosphere. They were getting trapped under this inversion layer in the winter. That's when you see it.
Really bad.
And really bad. So people were breathing that. The pollution controls weren't up to the snuff of what would be required today. And they had this waste ash. needed a place to put it. They were taking it, I'm not sure on this, somewhere out of state, and some was going to, I believe, the unlined Rutland landfill. And we had this really amazing DEC commission, Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner, Pat Perreno. He taught at the law school afterward. He was, I think he worked for Natural Resources Defense Council at some point in time in his background, his career background. He also worked at EPA. He was an administrator at EPA out on the West Coast somewhere, Seattle or something. And he was he was known for being tenacious to the prosecuting environmental violations. A lot of these laws were new, and there was a lot of tepid response that people didn't want to do it, but he took the bull by the horns and really busted a lot of people, and got these laws enforced and got them to be taken seriously. We got case law set. He was amazing, and we had the good fortune of CUNY hired him to take over, and there was a reorganization. They created this overarching Agency of Natural Resources, which is the same structure as now, which houses the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Department of Forests and Parks.
Okay.
And so they created this highest level position called the Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources, which at that time, the first person as Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources was Jonathan Lash. He was Commissioner of DEC. He became Secretary of ANR, and then Pat Perreno came in and became DEC Commissioner, which is that of the three departments: Fish and Wildlife, Forests and Parks, and Environmental Conservation. Environmental Conservation is the tough job. I mean, they're all tough, but critical because you're regulating everything: air, solid waste, hazardous waste, groundwater, drinking water, septic systems, wastewater treatment facilities, on and on it goes. So Pat Perreno comes in, and during this time frame, when you're a delegated state, you have to meet. You sign this delegation agreement, and EPA says, you sign this agreement, we'll give you all this money, we'll help you set up these programs. As I said earlier, we'll fund 90 to 95% of the cost of those programs, including office space, everything, your electric bill.
Wow.
And in exchange, you will implement programs that meet the minimums. And so you have to put laws on your books in the state of Vermont that mirror or exceed the federal minimums. And so Vermont, being the green state, and CUNY being the green governor, and they augmented those standards, and they passed a set of statutes that regulated hazardous air contaminants for the first time: hydrofurans, dioxins, all this kind of stuff I mentioned earlier. And that, when the Wheelabrator plant was built, the trash incinerator in Rutland was built, those weren't in place. So the technologies weren't up to snuff to meet those standards, and the siting of the plant, most particularly, was not in the right place because of that inversion layer that we spoke about. And
so that was even part of it too.
Yeah, it was huge. That was the
biggest one.
That was the cornerstone issue of area of concern. That and the ash.
Okay.
So I inherit this. Now it's gone through the bank. It's going through bankruptcy. They've got this plan set up. These guys apply for a permit. They called it Vermont Waste Solutions. Vermont Integrated Waste Solutions. VIWS. VIEWS was the acronym. And, they were trying to do the right thing, but the laws changed. They were focused on getting this, great deal of $2 million for, 10% of the price of the cost to build it they paid. And grabbing all that waste. And so they started signing what they called put or pay contracts, which required, if you want to take it to us, you have to give us every scrap of waste. And if you didn't, it's kind of like their wind turbine contracts. You needed to deliver this amount by contract. And if you fell short due to your recycling programs doing better and better and better, we would still charge you. It's put or pay. So we need to be guaranteed a certain income. And so too the investors on like the Sheffield wind turbine project, those are basically the equivalent of put or pay contracts. And if those turbines were shut down due to grid constraints, which they were, the investors still had to get their money, and so like Washington Electric had to pay for electricity they couldn't use. They couldn't access
it wasn't
because
being
the wind
generated.
wasn't being generated. So those are bad contracts to get into, and so Solid Waste District got in them, so they got caught in between, and that was a whole nother mess. I didn't get directly involved in it. I had to write a permit for this. So now there are these hazardous air contaminant standards in statute, which then needed the solid waste permits looked at air, water, and basically engineering of the landfill itself, the premises, and the operation of it as in its permitting review, application review, and oversight of the permitted facility. So I had to make these findings under this provision of statute for this, what they called an interim certification. It was kind of a bridge permit to the final permit. And they tried to use, instead of giving it a full certification, they used this interim certification process. It was not designed for this. It was designed to allow us to continue to operate unlined landfills, which didn't meet the new standards, but you could continue to operate them despite them not meeting regulatory standards until such time as a line landfill cell was built, and then you could transition to compliance. And so you had to have a schedule for coming into compliance and moving to that newer approach, that more environmentally protective approach. Well, this incinerator had no transition because what it was puking out was a vestige of where it was sited and how it was built and what these things put out. So they couldn't give it what they call a full certification because it didn't meet standards. But you couldn't give it an interim certification because there was no way to transition this unless you put wheels on it and wheeled it on top of a mountain somewhere in a rural community.
Yeah,
not something you're going to do with brick and mortar.
Well, and even that still, I mean, there's problems associated with this trash incinerator.
Yeah,
I mean, it's still
so I could
environmentally
not make
unsound.
the findings. So I had to make findings on behalf of the Secretary of A&R that this facility basically had a transition plan, but also that it met hazardous air contaminant standards, and I couldn't. And I had a memo from the engineer in the Air Pollution Control Division that said we can't permit this. It doesn't meet standards because there was a whole legal question about whether it would be subject to the new regulatory standards or grandfathered. Well, it had ceased operation, and determination of the Attorney General's office and attorneys in A&R, including Pat Perreno, our commissioner, were no, that grandfathering ceased when it ceased operation. It's been out of business for 3 years. So I had all this information around me, yet I was being told by my bosses, write the permit. And so I asked my boss, my immediate supervisor, how do I make this finding? He goes, oh, just write something. I said, well, I'll write that it doesn't meet it. And that's what I did. And I gave it to him. And he's like, oh, no. And he got really angry, came over to me. He said, just to write something. It doesn't comport with law. It doesn't comport with regulatory standards. And I tell you, blood vessel ready to blow out of his forehead. You knew what I meant, write something. You need to write something that says this complies. I said, but it doesn't. Well, we don't look at air pollution. We're the solid waste program. That's Air Pollution Control Division. And I went up and talked to the Air Pollution Control Division. They're like, well, we're not looking at it because that's a solid waste issue. So they were both passing the buck.
Saying, oh, it's not my problem.
Because they had to issue an air permit for it, too. And so the air permit was going to be leveraged off us issuing the interim certification. Say, well, there's an exemption in the law for these transitioning facilities, which it couldn't transition. So they were both doing this. Both directors, my director of solid waste was pointing to the air pollution control director. He was pointing to the solid waste director.
They were contingent upon each other.
Well, that's what they were arguing. Yes. But actually the law said, because my job was to interpret the statute as, it was clearly written, not to look for ways around it. It was clear on its face, as they say in legal jargon. And the law said, you shall not, or you shall find the following. And I had to make all the findings. It wasn't best 2 out of 5. I had to make all the findings. And I couldn't make 2 of them. And they're like, well, it's only 2. I was like, no, you shall make all, A-L-L. You shall find the following. And so I got tangled, and I said, okay. And I got a phone call from this woman, rest her soul, Joan Mulhern, It was meant to go to my supervisor, and he was playing basketball as he did at lunch, and I guess the game went overtime, and so I was in the office, so the secretaries directed the call to me, and I didn't know this woman from Adam or Eve, and and it's like, yeah, can I help you? Well, I just want to know when that draft certification is going to be issued for public comment. And I'm like, who are you? What does your organization do? I'm with VPIRG. I'm like, oh, I used to canvass for NIPIRG years back.
Which is the National Public Interest?
No, New York.
New York, okay.
Public Interest Research Group, and VPIRG is Vermont Public Interest Research Group. So I knew of them.
Okay.
That this was the Vermont chapter, if you will, of the larger organization. So I said, she's like, so where's the permit? I said, well, there's actually some conversation going on here, and I'm a little bit naive here. I just tell the truth, not knowing, not caring, maybe even at this point, whether they were going to be potential litigants against us if we issued something that didn't comport with law. And I said, well, I'm struggling with She's like, with what? I said, well, making these findings. And I had the law book, the green book, as we used to call it, the Title 10, Chapter 159 opened up, and I'm reading them to her. She's like, oh my God, there's a sound brain in the solid waste management division. I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, I've talked to your boss, and he just screams at me, I don't know what I'm talking about. And I talked to the Air Pollution Control Division, and so she's like, so am I understanding this right? Because I'm being told inside that I'm crazy. And she's like, no, you're right on. They're trying to rig the game. And I said, I thought so. So I said, can I talk to you after work? So we met up, went out for a beer, and I became fast friends with these people. And thankfully I did, and this was a very different organization back then. VPIRG was amazing. They were really a Vermont Public Interest Research Group. They cared about the public interest, which included public process, and environmental protection, among other things. They were amazing, and they were a shoestring operation. People didn't make much money. They had weak benefits, but they were there for the cause.
They believed in it.
Yeah, it was founded by Ralph Nader, who's still that way. It's not the same organization anymore, and it's very sad to me because I kept my job because of them. They helped me not get fired, because what I did was, after my boss blew a gasket, I went back and I actually called the labor union, state employees union, and talked to the attorney, and he said, are you a member? And I'm like, yeah. Okay, so then I can talk to you. And I told him my dilemma, and he said, well, if you don't do what you're told to do, they can fire you because that's insubordination. I said, but it's illegal. He said, yeah, well, you'd have to go to court and fight your way back in to get your job back. But there would be a time when you wouldn't get paid. We'd fight for your back pay. And there's always a panel of judges that decides whether you get your job back. They tend to try to find things that have nothing to do with what their initial reasoning for firing you is. They make up stuff,
sure,
and they market it to the judge. And so you're at risk if you're insubordinate. I recommend you not do that, or you think very hard. You got a young baby. Our son was just born 3 months prior. So I came up with this idea. I said, what if I do what I'm told to do? I make these fraudulent findings where I could not make true findings, and then I'll write a cover memo saying attached is the draft permit as directed. I was directed to do this. I was directed to do that, despite the law saying something else. So as you'll see, I made these findings. This is where they're flawed. And I laid out the whole legal premise for how the findings there were flawed, they were inappropriate, and I was forced to write them, and that they're illegal. So,
wow.
And I sent that to the secretary to A&R and my boss, and I actually copied Act 250 on it because they had a permit on it. Or
that board, you mean?
I sent it to, well, I didn't know what I was doing. I sent it to the environmental board, and I sent it to the local district environmental coordinator, even though it was in Rutland.
For 250.
For Act 250.
Okay. Just clarifying.
Because I had met this guy, Ed Stanek. That's another story. And I knew he would be at least interested in what my situation was. So this is before internet, so I used a fax machine and U.S. Post to get stuff out. So I mailed everything out, and then I faxed this stuff to Act 250 and the Environmental Board, just to make sure they got it, because I was afraid they might scoop it up. And
Somebody.
sure shooting, it went up to the secretary's office. They came flying down, and there was a CC list on the bottom of that cover memo. And they're like, we need to get every single one of those memos. And this is all going on in my office space around me. And excuse me, and angry faces. And
people are just mad at you.
Do you have any other copies of this? And I said, yeah, I got my copy. Of course, I'm not stupid.
Yeah.
I made copies and I had them out in my car. And this is a public record. They tried to make it confidential. They created this confidential file, which is red. The manila envelope is now a red envelope. And they put all the files that are a public record in a red file marked confidential, which is illegal. So I then, I met with the VPIRG person ongoing, Joan Mulhern, and then their attorney, Jenny Carter, and their executive director, John Gilroy, about this. And they kind of helped prop me up. And they're like, so they took the project away from me and they started personnel actions. Anything they could get me on. But they couldn't, because we had thought this through. But this stuff was in play. There was one charge, bringing embarrassment to the state.
That's what they came up with.
That was a charge. And
what they based that on?
There was an agency policy written back in the 80s, and they applied it to me. You cannot do something that might bring embarrassment to the state. Well, that meant, running around the office naked, or going,
not these
telling
days.
the governor to go F himself at an agency meeting, or something like that. You better fire the guy. I'd be right behind you doing that. But they didn't mean telling the truth. I mean, the embarrassment by me exposing this was not because of me. It was because of what they directed me to do. That is violate the law.
Mm.
So they then took the project away. My boss took it over. They scheduled a public hearing in Rutland, public meeting. I went, because I care about people and I don't want to publicly embarrass the commissioner. We now have a new commissioner, Elizabeth McLean. I skipped some parts. So Cunin doesn't run. Snelling runs, becomes governor. He honors his commitment to these investors who bought this thing, and that's when this process kicks in. He dies in office.
That's right. August
of 1991. This is right when I'm in the throes of writing this permit. So what do we do? What do we do? And Howard Dean, it was this question whether the lieutenant governor, Howard Dean, would assume the office of governor, or would they have to call a special election? And this was being discussed, and the Attorney General's office rendered the decision, and it was headed by a guy named highly regarded Republican. Back when these Republicans were amazing. They were so far left of what we call liberal Democrats.
Yeah,
they're not liberal. They're captured. They've sold their soul. This
crony capitalists.
They're pathetic.
Yeah.
And so when I really dislike them when conservative commentators call them the liberal, leftist, socialist legislature.
Yeah.
They are not.
You and I have had that conversation.
They are corporate capitalists, and they have no regard for the law or human beings. The quote-unquote old liberals, lefties, cared about humans and human beings first. VPIRG's first interest was the public, the consumer, the we people, the poor people. That's where and then by extension, the environment, because that affects poor people more directly than wealthier people. They can move to the estate in Montana or the Greek island, Poor people are stuck. And so they were highly focused on that. Not anymore. Not a bit. And so too with VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and Conservation Law Foundation, and innumerable other tag-along organizations, Vermont Sierra Club, Vermont Conservation Voters. They all work in lockstep. There's no diversity of opinion allowed, tolerated. Vermonters for a Clean Environment, we're considered rogue. They try to pan us as right-wing MAGA, whatever they can make up. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because we're exposing what they're doing. And just like when I was at A&R, This is now the Dean administration, the Democratic administration, and I was exposing them, their foibles. Howard Dean's position, right or wrong, was I inherited this office. Jeff Amestoy, Attorney General, said yes, he takes over Snelling's post until the next election, which is whatever it was, a year and a half away. And so Howard felt like he didn't earn it, and I'm not that he's right. And he said, I'm going to keep every single person in office that Snelling appointed. It's not my role to judge this administration. It's my role to keep the ship of state running.
Sure.
The gears working. And I give him a lot of credit for that. Not being a fan of Howard Dean's, I think that was the right thing. Absolutely the right thing to do. And here's an interesting tidbit, and maybe she'll listen to this. Elizabeth McLean, Wibbs McLean, who then became the DEC commissioner under Howard Dean. And how did she become that? Elizabeth McLean was a leader in the House as a state representative and a leader of the Republican Party. Very bright woman, went to Middlebury College, wonderful person. And, dyed in the wool, I'm going to say old school Republican.
Sure.
She'd be considered a lefty commie now. She's just highly ethical person, and she was the commissioner when I whistle blew on this draft permit at that hearing that night. I told you about that, and I'll get to that. So Howard Dean takes office. Elizabeth McLean, under Snelling, when Snelling took office for the second time around, he appointed her as his chief of staff. So she sat in on all the cabinet meetings, and which are generally held every Tuesday still. And so she would have been privy to all the policy discussions, all the political strategies, all that stuff that occurs behind a closed door on a weekly basis in the governor's office. And so when Howard Dean took over and refused to change out anybody, he goes to meet, the governor goes to meet and, kind of introduces himself to the Speaker of the House, Ralph Wright, which Howard had a relationship with because he used to be a representative in the legislature before running for lieutenant governor, an office he was elected to. And he met with the Senate President Pro Tem, head of the Senate, at the same time. Well, Ralph Wright was a big Boston labor union power broker, boss hog guy. Tough guy, you don't mess with Ralph.
Sure.
Tough Irishman.
Okay.
And Wibbs was a tough Irish woman, by the way. Elizabeth McLean, her nickname is Wibbs.
Okay.
And so Howard reportedly went into Ralph Wright's, and I heard this from good authority, Ralph Wright's office. And Ralph and Howard sits down, and they were going to discuss political needs and, the Democratic Party's needs, Ralph Wright's, vision going forward. And Ralph thought, he had died and gone to heaven. Not that he was happy that Snelling died, but here was an opportunity, right?
Sure.
There was a changing of political party with the changing of the governors, Howard Dean being a Democrat. So reportedly, Wibbs sits down, who used to give Ralph Wright a lot of problems when she was a leader in the House of Representatives and a leader of the Republican Party. And Ralph reportedly said, "What's she doing here?" And Howard's like, "Well, as I told you, I'm keeping everyone in place, and she was Snelling's chief of staff, and she's going to be my chief of staff, and I like her."
Yeah.
So do I.
Yeah.
And as a lefty, by the way, I always say I'm left of Bernie Sanders because I'm real left, old school left. Bernie is not anymore, except on some issues. But I collaborate best with the Vermont Republicans in the House and Senate because they still care about poor people and working class people like the left used to. They've abandoned them. So
let's get there, but let's
we'll
keep
get
going.
there.
Yeah,
we'll
let's
get
keep
there.
going.
So Ralph goes, "What's she's doing here?" So reportedly he asked Wibbs to leave, chief of staff McLean to leave, and they had this they had a dust up, and Ralph reportedly said, "Look, you can do whatever you want, Howard Dean, Governor Dean, but I will not tolerate your coming in here with your chief of staff if she is Wibbs McLean. She's a Republican operative, and I need to know that what's said in here stays in here and doesn't get fed to the Republican Party leadership. you know. And so if you're going to keep her as chief of staff, you won't be meeting me anymore with me anymore because chief of staff needs to be there. And so through that, he pressured Howard to remove Wibbs from being his chief of staff. And so the commissioner of DEC under Cunin was this guy Tim Burke, who had been a House rep and a real true environmentalist, old school, great environmentalist. He wound up becoming commissioner under Cunin of DEC, and then when Snelling came in, Snelling kept him on because Snelling is a real moderate guy, and he's like he kept many of the Democrats on, unless there was a problem,
sure,
someone being hyper partisan or something. And Tim Burke had good cred, and Snelling knew him, but Tim didn't want to stay for a lot of reasons that he and I spoke about. So he left, and so there was this opening in DEC. So Howard asked Wibbs if she would take that spot, and Wibbs became commissioner. Fast forward, I write this draft permit, cover it, memorandum it.
That's right.
They take the project away from me. They bring innumerable personnel actions against me. They're all in play. Suddenly, I'm a problem employee. Lo and behold, must be a coincidence.
Yeah.
And but I went and met with the commissioner, despite her bringing personnel actions against me, because I understand what's going on. And I told her that. She didn't know me from Eve, and
sure.
And we talked, and she said, "Well, I've spoken in anticipation of this meeting. I've spoken with the director of the Air Pollution Control Division and the director of the Solid Waste Division, and they say you're wrong." And I said, Wibbs, I'm going to whistleblow tonight, and I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt and at least let you know. And I walked through the statutes with her. She had her counsel with her. This guy, Charlie Bristow, who was a great guy. He used to be legislative counsel, head of legislative counsel office. And, he was focused on the law. He wouldn't say a word.
Sure.
But I said, I really ask that you withdraw this permit. You can go to the hearing and withdraw it. And she goes, no, we're going to go forward. I trust my directors. I said, okay.
Fine.
That's fine. That's your prerogative. And I just want to let you know, I got a meeting with the ACLU, Vermont ACLU, as soon as I leave here, which I went down to, and they said they would represent me. I need that commitment on short notice. So I went to the hearing, and I spoke at the podium. VPIRG spoke. Sue Minter spoke. She was pregnant with her daughter-to-be, Ariel. She was I think Ariel was born a few days later.
Wow. Maybe
2 days, maybe 1 day. She was as pregnant as you get without, being in the throes of giving birth. And she had a letter written. I remember she spoke, just read the letter. Now, fast forward, Sue has claimed that she was an activist and she was instrumental in shutting down that waste incinerator for good. She was not. The only thing she did was attend a couple of meetings with VPIRG and wrote a 1 or 2 page letter, which she read into the record. And then, no fault to her, she became a mom, and that's what she focused her attention on, to her credit. But she was not a leader in it. It was Joan Mulhern. It was Lou from VPIRG. It was Lou Milford, who was head of the Conservation Law Foundation. Lou litigated another case which had, depending on how that ended up, it would have repercussions for this. He won that case, had to do with a medical waste incinerator up in Colchester that used to be located next to Costco.
Okay.
Which had the same problems with not meeting the air emission standards. And the judge threw out that permit, which meant they could not issue this trash incinerator permit. So that died because of that case law. I think it was Judge Ernie Gibson who wrote that decision. So they tried for a couple of years trying to figure out ways by standing on their head and standing the law further on its head, but ultimately, that incinerator did not get re-permitted. I did not get fired. Elizabeth McLean, who was at odds with me, realized that I was the only guy who had her back. So we became very, very collegial after that. And
McLean is Wibbs?
Wibbs.
Okay. And she's the Department of...
We're friends to this day. She's wonderful.
Well, I'm sorry, I just want to clarify.
She was commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation under Howard Dean.
Okay. I do want to read a quick comment here from Timothy Page, who wrote in. So that's another part of the show is we have commenters, so
sure.
people can ask
Hi,
questions. Tim. Yeah. Tim is actually Guy's son, so he watches.
Hot shit.
Yeah,
hot stuff.
But don't worry, you're allowed to swear. It's the internet. Although Guy doesn't really like it. But anyway, the left became the establishment and became the conservatives in the government. They really screwed up all the nomenclature. Liberal, Republican lovers of democracy are now labeled conservatives. The establishment calls them liberals and Democrats while attempting to oppose both liberty and democracy.
That's right.
Progressives regress to previous failed ideas, yet they claim they are moving forward.
They should be called the Regressive Party, right?
Yes. And then he said, it may be my Asperger's talking, but it's infuriating at times, a lot of times.
And Tim, that's exactly, underscoring my point. This stuff has been flipped on its head. These things no longer apply, these generalizations. And I've never liked generalizations, to listen to the rhetoric even back then. Elizabeth McLean was pushing through this draft permit.
Yeah.
And but she trusted her staff. She started at the right place. And I can only guess that Charlie Bristow, her general counsel, said, John's not crazy. He's right. Because soon after Charlie, I actually went down and met with Charlie and Wibbs about these personnel actions that are pending, and they're like, we can't really meet with you because these are pending actions. I don't have an attorney here. You can meet with me.
Sure.
I said, if you want to fire me, fine. I'll get another job, but I'll win this too. But I just want you guys to come to harm, and I said, Charlie, your job as attorney, DEC attorney, is to ensure that the law is followed, correct? Yes. And I said, the law is not being followed. I kind of helped you guys not come into conflict to protect you. I did my job. No one else did their job. You should be lauding me. You should be hugging me. And the personnel actions are being lodged against the wrong people. And Charlie is like, and at some point, he came up to me in the hallway and he said, John, I just want to apologize. I can't say much except that I'm up to my ass in alligators. I never heard that saying before. So I'll never forget that. And he said, just be patient with me and thank you. And then after that, everything got dropped and things got spun around. Directors got pulled out of their programs.
Wow.
One director got banished. You're not allowed at the legislature. So
holy cow.
It was a major upset. The incinerator didn't get built. And ultimately, because it sat for so long, you can imagine the way these incinerators work. You burn trash. It's power generating facilities, whether it's a nuclear electric plant or a waste to energy plant generating electricity, it's the same technology. You have something that creates heat to boil water, to make steam, to spin these turbines. And the waste to energy plant in Rutland they could have taken out the heat plant that was an incinerator and stuck in a nuclear power plant, and it would have done the same thing. Boiled water to make steam, to spin turbines, to generate electricity. So these turbines are massive. I mean, stories tall, put in with a crane inside this building. There were two turbines, I think. And so these things sit on, for folks that are mechanically inclined, they sit on a bearing. The shaft that goes down the center of these turbines sits on two bearings or a number of bearings, like a crankshaft on a car would. And you need to, I found out in hindsight, if you're not going to run the plant, you need to, every 3 months, just spin that a little bit, that turbine, so it's not sitting on the same place on the shaft,
wearing
on the bearing, because it creates an indentation, kind of like a tire sitting in place for too long. It gets flat, and you go down the road, and you get bumped for a while.
That makes sense. Interesting.
So when they decided to part out this plant, they had planned to sell the turbines to China because they were building waste energy plants all over without pollution controls.
Didn't matter.
And so they sold all the infrastructure to China, but when the engineers looked at the turbines, they said scrap them because not all the bearings were damage, as I explained, because they didn't rotate them to keep them healthy, and they were also rusted inside. I guess there's enough acid dust from the ash in the air and stuff. It damaged the turbines, so they were irreparable. So those went to the scrap heap.
Can I just say quickly, the whole concept to me, I really hope we don't have any of these around the state right now, do we?
No.
And the whole concept to me just sounds like such an awful idea. I could see why they would think, oh, we should try this. This is a good way to get rid of waste, and we're actually going to use it to make energy. But like, I'm just thinking like of the process of like burning trash, then to heat up water. It just seems like so disgusting. Like everything involved just seems like it's not a good idea.
No, we have the technology to make it into milk and honey.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
They built a plant over in Claremont. I think it was Wheelabrator as well.
Is that New Hampshire?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that plant was operational, and VPERG, and because of course that stuff blows on us.
Yeah.
And it's right on the border, and ultimately, Senator Dick McCormick, who's retiring from his role in the Senate finally, but he was senator back then. He was able to get a law passed that said if there are any contracts, interstate waste contracts, waste management contracts, which the solid waste districts on the state border of New Hampshire collaborate across the border. To this day, Greater Brook Valley Solid Waste District has a contract or an agreement with the district over in New Hampshire, and they take their trash from that area of Vermont, White River Junction, Greater White,
Sure.
Heartland, Hartford area. It goes over to New Hampshire, to the Lebanon landfill. They have a big line landfill facility, and there's some kind of agreement that when that gets full, that district will then work to open a landfill here in Vermont, and they actually own a permitted site, or a previously permitted site that they could put a line landfill in to then put their waste in when the Lebanon facility closes. So anyway, Senator Dick McCormick was able to get a law passed that said any interstate contracts involving solid waste, where they are to go to a disposal facility or treatment facility, which an incinerator is a treatment facility, solid waste treatment facility, they need to be at minimum comport with Vermont standards for air and solid waste and hazardous waste and groundwater, all the standards that are in play under Vermont statutes. They need to meet our minimum regulatory requirements, including the hazardous air contaminant standards. Well, that incinerator had the same problems as the incinerator here, so they could not transport and under contract to have the waste go to the Claremont incinerator any longer, which was another shoe to drop, which ultimately led to its death now. So that was my first unintended, unplanned whistleblowing effort at A&R, and I kind of got this reputation, and I got fairly emboldened that I am not under my watch going to allow A&R to violate the law. And I'd be in meetings, they'd say, well, the regulation is stupid. And it might be an area where they was like, God, what a stupid regulation. It needs to be changed. And I'd say, okay, then there's a process for that.
Sure.
You amend the regulation, you run it through the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules in the public process, and you get it changed. If the statute needs to be changed, you do that through legislative effort. And I was backed up by all the environmental groups. They loved me. And they defended me, and they protected me. The press was, pretty enamored with me because I was the only person that I know of that ever whistleblew. Nobody would dare do that.
Go against the grain.
Yeah, it's amazing. And people who were generally good people on the outside hated me inside A&R because they said, "Oh, you brought embarrassment to my program. We're known nationally as being corrupt." Like, no, you're not. There was this one permit. You're thinking too much.
Yeah.
And it's going to affect my resume and my job prospect. And people came up with all these ludicrous things. No, you didn't write the permit.
Well, it's circulating within the community.
Yeah,
people they were really upset about it.
As if people focus that much on it. But
that's a good point.
But Sam Hemingway and Candace Page were these environmental reporters up at the Free Press. I think Sam became an editor at some point, as did Candy. There was Susan Small here, and John Dillon, and James Bandler, and what was her name? Maura Weber, and Diane Derby, who came to work for, I think she works for the Democratic Party now, if I'm not mistaken, but she worked for Jeffords and later worked for Leahy. All these folks, wrote copy about what went on when I was at A&R. I was pretty well respected. Senator McCormick and his brother Kurt McCormick had my back. Chuck Ross, who chaired House Natural Resources. What was his name? George Little. Here's an example of how things used to be in Vermont when this was a wonderful place politically. That State House, which I now call the Snake House, for good reason.
Oh yeah.
When the Democratic Party, controlled the Senate in 1992-93, the chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, powerful committee, must have been a Democrat, right? No, it was George Little, a Republican. And George Little was chair of the VNRC board. The Republicans in this state were so highly regarded. There wasn't this throttling at the throat. Yeah, there was Ralph Wright playing politics and having fist fights outside the Thrush Tavern, which we've heard about, bloodied on the asphalt.
It's awesome.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. But there was true decorum. There was respect. The stuff that Senator Philip Baruth, who heads the Senate, the stuff he pulls, that would never have happened. The term NIMBY, not in my backyard, the acronym being NIMBY. I distinctly remember a lobbyist for industry. I'm going to leave his name out. I remember his name. He was kind of a dark hat, real black hat lobbyist, pretty sleazy. Started calling folks who would oppose projects NIMBYs. And he was, of course, trying to gut Act 250 because you had to be a NIMBY. You had to have a project in your backyard in order to get legal standing in the process. So, too, now, under Act 250 and at the Public Utility Commission, which they're both processes on environmental criteria mirror each other, you had to be an adjoiner or have what the legal terminology calls an affected interest, affected legal interests. So, like if you were a neighbor to the trash incinerator in Rutland, you could get standing. If you lived in the valley where that inversion layer was, temperature inversion was causing health risk to your little children and to you, breast cancer and all these other maladies, you had an affected interest. You'd have to argue it, but you had an affected interest. So under the law, you had to be a NIMBY. And Joel Mulhern, the lobbyist for VPIRG, the legislative affairs director for VPIRG, was in the committee room. I was in the committee room. I can't remember the exact subject matter, but this attorney lobbyist, it's all I can do not to say his name, I'm not going to say it, started calling people NIMBYs. And Jones said, Mr. Chair, who was Kurt McCormick, Dick's brother, that's a really derogatory term. And it's being used in a derogatory way toward people who are just protecting their rights under the law. They're following the law. And this guy is attacking them for following the law and exercising their due process rights, calling them a NIMBY. It's outrageous. And Kurt said to the lobbyist, you need to cease using that term. And by the way, I'm putting everyone on notice. That term is never to be used in this committee room ever again. It's derogatory. It's like calling a woman a slut or something,
Sure.
It's that derogatory. Now, fast forward. So that was VPIRG's position. It was outrageous. It was derogatory. They now use the term in their publications, written publications, on their internet, in testimony. If you dare question, the technologies that they were behind these renewable energy technology, energy.
Let's just quickly talk about that. I think we should point out VPIRG represents a lot of renewable energy industry,
Well, they say they don't. They say they
yeah.
represent the public
Well,
interest.
of course they do, but which is ultimately to stop climate change now is public interest, right? So like, I guess my point is
well, to mitigate, they're not going to stop it.
To mitigate. Well, of course. Do they say stop it though?
I don't know what they say. It morphs. It morphs. They were categorically against PFAS, this poly and chlorinated, these fluorinated chemicals that are very resistant to breaking down in the environment.
That's right.
They call them forever chemicals, which super toxic. They just came out with a study. They're finding in male testicles. It turns out the body stores them, and there's all these issues with that.
Which is not a bad thing to be fighting against.
No, it's the right thing.
It's the right thing.
And when they were categorically said we need to ban all PFAS, all production, all use. We need to pass laws, and then it became. I was probably one of the first people to bring this to public attention. That it's, and I sent these emails to representatives of VNRC and VPIRG and CLF by email, and they never responded, that these technologies employ PFAS everywhere. And at first, people were saying, they were the folks in the solar business saying, that's not true, that's not true. But it is. And they use this PFAS chemical as a mold release agent. The blades for wind turbines are fiberglass, and they go in a mold, and generally in China. It's where they make all this junk. And they used to use, when they used to make fiberglass boats when I was growing up, I grew up on the water, and I was a commercial fisherman at one time. So I was aware of boat building and even helped work on boats under construction. And they would spray the molds for fiberglass boat hulls with wax.
Sure.
And you need to make sure you wipe that with acetone, those hulls, before you try to get a bottom paint or anything to stick to them, and even sand, like gel coat. But they used wax. Well, they graduated now. They're using PFAS, and they spray the molds with that, and then they pop the blades out, and those blades are covered with PFAS, and they assemble them, and they go up. The seals are made with these polyfluorinated chemicals. They use these chemicals. They add it to gear oil to reduce wear. You ever hear that stuff called Slick 50? Anybody who's a motorhead out there?
I think I might know.
There are these additives that I don't know if they're still for sale or not, but they used to be available. You add it to your motor oil, and it would increase the longevity of your car.
Really?
And increase your mileage and performance and all that. It was Teflon, this PFAS chemical. And you cannot destroy this stuff at the temperatures you might see in a trash incinerator, which are like 12 to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. They need to exceed 1850 to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit to be destroyed, to destruct the chemical bonds are so strong. So
and
another
they still
problem,
get burnt and then go into the atmosphere.
Yeah, so they get volatilized, atomized.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem. We are in this country heavily, and China and everywhere in the world is heavily reliant on waste incineration as a means to get rid of trash. So when you throw out your couch that's sprayed with Scotchgard, or your wind turbine blades, if you were to cut it up and put them in a trash incinerator, that stuff then gets put into the atmosphere and then rains down on your cropland. Super toxic. And you add that to the microparticulate plastics, the microplastics that are also raining down over our atmosphere. It's a pretty bad situation right now.
And not to mention the geoengineering going on, but that's a whole different subject.
But suddenly these environmental organizations that were hugely concerned about PFAS back in the Shumlin days,
sure,
they've gone silent or almost silent. They support legislation. They're not at the lead anymore, having been at the lead, VPIRG in particular, on PFAS. They have a posting here and there about it, generally concerned. But they no longer take the position that we need to ban it. They said we need to ban it where used, if you press them, where it's used on items that are disposable. But we don't oppose it being used as just, to make technologies better, which is where they predominate in terms of these plants that manufacture all these items, car parts and everything, paints. The paint that's on my standing seam roof. I didn't realize till after I put it on.
Yeah, that's what you noticed. Yeah,
maybe your relative's roof across the road. Look at them. Look at the ingredients. They're fluorinated paints, so it's the same stuff, and that's why they can have a 50-year warranty or a lifetime warranty. This stuff does not degrade. So anyway, so this is how they morph. They're not intellectually honest. Yeah. They're very dishonest in terms of their positioning on environmental issues. It morphs with the political winds and with the funders' needs. So they used to have this huge conflict of interest policy. I'm picking on VPIRG for good reason because I was very much aware of what went on there.
Tear them apart. I
will.
I'm happy.
I'm not here to tear them apart. I'm here to tell the truth.
Absolutely.
I have, I want them to make corrections to their behavior and how they advocate and who they advocate for, and become what they used to be, which was an amazing organization. In the image of Ralph Nader, they are no longer in Ralph's image, so they used to have a policy that they would never put industry on their board. And I remember on a Friday being in their office, got off work, I was in their office, and it was time to hand out paychecks, and the executive director comes in, and he's like looking down, and Matt Rubin, who I think was the chair of the board, he's still on the board, really good guy, he took out his own paycheck, checkbook, and wrote checks to each of the staff people to cover payroll, because VPIRG could not make payroll. That's how lean an organization they were. They didn't take money from corporations. That was the antithesis of what they stood for. And it was always a struggle to have Matt on their board, because he was an environmentalist for sure, but he then got into what he considered green technology. Here and these other guys, John Warshaw being another guy, and they bought these old decrepit dams and turned them into hydro dams. The idea being, spin a turbine, the water's going over the dam anyway. What harm could it do but make electricity instead of burning fossil fuels, right?
Sure.
We all know there's issues with dams too. There's nothing that's really good.
No,
what we do,
it's
it destroys the salmon runs. It's killed the salmon. The Atlantic salmon doesn't run up the Connecticut anymore because of them. But Matt, at some point, got permits from A&R to build what's now known as the Winooski 1 hydroelectric project up in Winooski. It's the old mill dam that ran the woolen mill up there, and he turned it into a hydro plant. And because of that, and because he was on the board of directors, there was a sit-down meeting. And this is all history that none of the present
they have no
staff
idea
at CLF, Conservation Law Foundation, or VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, or VPIRG have any direct
knowledge, or the
legislature
for that matter too,
or the legislature. And so what happened was, by virtue of Matt applying for a permit, VPIRG said, we're not going to get involved, but the staff felt so uncomfortable, they went to the board, Joe Mulhern, Jenny Carter, John Gilroy, exec director, and said, we're really uncomfortable with this. We now have a board member who's running a business, who's got a permit in play at A&R, or he's pursuing a permit, a water quality permit to put in a dam, which has negative consequences to fish runs and stuff, and Matt's doing the best job he can, but we shouldn't be put in this position as environmental people. We feel very uncomfortable with this. And by comparison to what's going on there now, it's just like, it's so pales in comparison. So what they did was CLF, VNRC, and VPIRG sat down, and VPIRG said, we no longer want to deal with water quality issues, groundwater, surface water, streams, lakes, any of that. And we want you, CLF and VNRC, to be the point organizations on that. And we'll take over some of your burden. So the real trade was VNRC became the water program advocacy organization, and VPIRG became the air toxins, hazardous waste, solid waste advocacy organization. And they created this Chinese wall kind of between them on water quality between VNRC and VPIRG. CLF continued to manage all that, oversee it, because they were kind of like, at the time, litigation was done for VPIRG and VNRC by CLF, even though
CLF is who again?
Just Conservation Law Foundation.
Okay, just
they're out of Montpelier.
Yep.
VNRC is in VPIRG. So they came up with this kind of handshake agreement so that Matt could continue in his role on the board and that they wouldn't feel a conflict of interest. As minor as it was, fast forward, Matt's on the board. Now Matt, this is under Douglas, Matt applies for a wind turbine project permit up in the Northeast Kingdom. Suddenly there's not a conflict of interest. No concern. VPIRG didn't say, oh, VNRC, you need to take this because, and that's really where, from my perspective, as an outsider, things really started going wrong. And then they started putting people on the board that were renewable energy developers and other developers. They did put a guy who was a trash hauler on the VPIRG board way back when, but he had gotten out of the business. So he had knowledge of the industry, but he was, they called him the hippie garbage man. His name is Biff Mithofer. And, they put him on the board because he's very wealthy and he's very generous. And he wanted to give the VPIRG. And there was a big conversation about whether to accept money from him. And they didn't until, because he was a member like anyone can be, but he wasn't like a donor.
Sure.
Until he got out of the business of trash management.
Okay.
And he did get into some recycling, like tear down buildings and recycle the frames and stuff like that, groovy stuff. But he got on their board. They put like labor union people on. So they really were consistent. And then it really changed. I will say it was sometime after Paul Burns became executive director and James Moore was working there. And they got this guy on the board who worked at Ben & Jerry's, and he and James Moore started a business. It was actually started at VPIRG. They started a business, and Dwayne Peterson is the other guy's name. And suddenly conflict of interest went out the window. Representative Tony Klein, chair of House Natural Resources, excoriated them. They were lobbying. James Moore was lobbying for law changes, which directly benefited the bottom line of this business that was quasi VPIRG. So then VPIRG, I guess, feeling heat, spun that off, and it became Sun Common. And
okay.
The principals were, the co-presidents were James Moore and Dwayne Peterson.
When was this, by the way? You said it was Douglas years, so.
Was that Douglas years? No, I think I might have been Shumlin years at this point. I don't know. It was like 2010.
Okay, that'd be I believe.
But
Shumlin.
You want to talk about conflict? So this is where the conflict of interests get crazy. All right. So now they got this interest in renewable energy development. I think from the initial standpoint, trying to better the planet, right? We're trying to eliminate fossil fuel emissions for all the reasons everyone knows. They're not good. But we derive huge benefits, folks, from fossil fuels. And we can talk about that in a minute. But so Green Mountain Power had a president, Mary Powell, who was very aggressive in marketing herself and being involved in Vermont politics. She got herself on the Vermont Land Trust Board as its executive director, as its chair. She got herself on the Vermont Public Radio Board at the same time as she's president of Green Mountain Power. And she definitely influenced what was going on at those organizations in not a good way. And she held a lot of sway with VPIRG, so that VPIRG started playing footsie with Green Mountain Power. There's a funder, I'll leave the name out because I don't want to spoil this person's name or reputation, but there was a funder who was very concerned, rightly so, about the state of our planet and our climate. And this funder ponied up what I understand to be $60,000, and they hired a lobbyist, Bob Stannard, who was a former representative, who used to work for Biff Mithofer. Starting to see the connections here.
Sure.
And but he's a good guy. He tries to do the right thing generally, and his task was to shut down Vermont Yankee because of all the hazards associated with an old nuclear power plant. I, at the time, had been for in excess of 20 years on an trained up emergency response team that would have responded where there had been a quote unquote event at Vermont Yankee nuclear plant. If there was a meltdown or some release, I would have been on this environmental sampling team.
Holy cow.
Right after the plume. They call it the post-plume response team. So the plume is released. There's another team, federal team, that would have come in. They would have had planes come in with monitoring devices, and they monitor the plume, and they map the plume, and they track the plume. And we're all trained up about plume tracking, just generally what it's about, and mapping out where it would have been. And then we would have done environmental sampling, groundwater, soil, eggs, milk, butter, lettuces, whatever was going on, people's homes, businesses, schools. And so we were all trained up for that. And actually, we did a drill. We did many drills, but we actually did because the training is so similar, we did a drill with federal agencies to deal with whether to be a pandemic. Because there was when that was that pandemic.
Swine flu.
No.
In 2000?
No, what was 2000s? That one that was going on?
Ebola.
Ebola.
So that was probably 14, 15, right? 2000?
I think it was
earlier?
Late aughts or something with Ebola, and they knocked it out.
I think it was swine flu back then, because Ebola, I just have distinct memories of.
It was under Obama, I know that.
Ebola was?
Yeah.
Ebola? Okay, so that was,
yeah.
I think it was late 14, 15, because I just have distinct memories of one of my youngest cousins at Thanksgiving. We were all joking about Ebola, which...
Yeah, so it might be right.
Maybe not the funniest joke,
right.
but...
I don't have a direct memory of that.
Anyway, sorry.
So when I worked at A&R, I was also on this response team, as were a number of officials across state agencies.
Okay.
And I don't know how I got on this tangent. Oh, Yankee. So Bob Stannard, his task was, he was funded $60,000. Do whatever you can in your power to get legislation passed to shut down Vermont Yankee. It was in VPIRG, CLF, probably VNRC, priority, Sierra Club priority. They're all linked at the hip. And how do I know this? Because Bob told me. Because I then was well thought of among VPIRG circles. They liked me. I had a history with that organization. I defended many of their priorities. I mean, I just told you about the waste incineration thing, but there were numerous occasions where I briefed them on what was going on, or I worked with the Attorney General's office, which was wonderful to work with at that time. It wasn't so politicized as it is now under Charity and Sorrell and all of them, TJ. It was under Jeff Amistoy, who was excellent. Another Republican. Go figure.
Yeah.
And then he became a Supreme Court judge. But
for the state.
Vermont's Supreme Court. Mm-hmm.
That's incredible.
Chief Justice. Act 60 was born out of the Brigham decision that he wrote, or collaborated on anyway. So they pushed to shut down Yankee. Well, Green Mountain Power had a major financial stake. I believe Guy Page would know, 40%.
Yeah,
in Vermont Yankee.
He would know. I don't know the answer to that.
And so they had
maybe Tim knows. Tim's listening.
Stake in that. So what do? You got to buy off GMP. Well, GMP doesn't want to give up nuclear power, but Green Mountain Powell, Mary Powell, got in the back room and they did this quid pro quo. And what was that? Well, Bob Stannard and VPIRG and all VNRC, definitely VNRC, cut this deal. They said, we will not engage any longer to fight legislative efforts to green up Hydro-Quebec, to call that renewable energy. Vermont, up to that point, considered it non-renewable because it was industrial scale, whatever terminology they use, but large hydro was considered non-green for a multiple of reasons. So they agreed to blind eye to not engage to I don't see anything. I see nothing.
I know nothing.
Even though they vehemently opposed the original licensing of or permitting of, the contracting by Green Mountain Power with Hydro-Quebec back in the 90s. And I fought that fight, as a citizen with the Korean Inuit. I think Jim Dumont might have been the attorney working on that. But anyway, now VPIRG doesn't care about that. VNRC doesn't care about it. I mean, all these priority issues, suddenly they don't have an opinion about. They're not going to engage. In fact, they don't care about them. Well, why? Well, if you call that energy green, then what Green Mountain Power can then do is they build these wind turbines up in Lowell, and they sell that power at a premium, the renewable energy credits at a premium. They take those premium dollars, and because none of the other New England states, ISO New England runs our grid, none of the other New England states consider that green energy, the renewable energy credits that would flow from that Hydro-Quebec power, the value of them is really low. So they take these high value credits, sell them to Connecticut, where at the time they banned wind turbines. They didn't allow permitting of. We, the quote-unquote green state, build these wind turbines. They market these RECs, renewable energy credits, to Connecticut, get top dollar, because there's different tiers and different pricings depending on type of renewable energy. That's the top tier pricing-wise REC. They get all that money, and then they only take a piece of that and buy the equivalent amount of power for less money, so they get it, I don't know, make up a number, 40 cents on the dollar, and then they pocket the rest.
I see.
So Green Mountain Power, it was a huge windfall. So this is what they conspired to do. So VPIRG, I did not know this. I had heard there was a bill working its way through it, and it was had a potential to pass that was going to consider, after work, ran over there to talk to my representatives to stop this. And Bob Standard sees me. I'm like, hey, Bob. He goes, what are you doing here, John? I'm like, I'm here to stop this. Did you hear? And he goes, come here. And James Moore, who is the president of Sun Common now, and Bob were in the corner, and he said, come here. And he said, what are you going to do? Don't do that. I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, well, there's this quid pro quo we cut with Green Mountain Power, and if you stop that, we're not going to be able to shut down Yankee, because then Green Mountain Power is going to oppose.
Oh, I understand now.
The shutting down of Yankee.
I understand why they did that.
So what happened was VPIRG went neutral on HQ becoming considered renewable energy in Vermont for the purposes of meeting renewable energy portfolio standards under law. And in trade, Green Mountain Power would go neutral on the shutdown of Yankee. They wouldn't advocate, but they would go neutral. And I got to wonder, if you're a shareholder, how legal that was. But that's what they did. And so then I find out this. So, I still went. I was unsuccessful because this was already inked. It was like the last night or days of the session. And it became law. And, as we know, Yankee got shut down. And then I learned, that 40%, whatever, of the Green Mountain Power's energy porportfolio was now picked up by Seabrook plant. Green Mountain Power down in New Hampshire.
Okay. Okay. I thought that was Connecticut.
And I spoke with folks over at VPIRG. I'm like, are you guys aware of this? Yeah. I'm like, but we got Yankee shut down. I said, I'm on the Yankee response team. If Yankee were to melt down, the impact in terms of people directly impact in terms of numbers, actual numbers, that's people within a 50-mile radius, which is kind of the zone that they map out as the high impact zone.
Yeah.
The number of actual people within that 50-mile radius of Vermont Yankee would be tiny as compared. Look, what are you guys doing? And that's when it dawned on me. It was in that conversation, quite frankly, with Paul Burns.
Your best buddy.
Talking to you, Paul.
Yeah.
Try to deny it. And I said, Paul, what is going on here? What happened to public interest and the impact on? So no longer did they care as much about the impacts of nuclear power or the impacts of a meltdown or a release from a nuclear power plant upon people. They were more interested in feathering the nest, as they say, and pleasing Green Mountain Power. And that's where they really turned the corner, from my understanding. And it's just been in steep decline ever since. And it's just not all VPERG. You look at Sierra Club.
Yeah.
They sold leases, gas leases on their properties. The Nature Conservancy's done similar things, drilling for oil on their conserved properties. I mean, it goes on and on and on. This is an important, I think, anecdote, and I tell a lot of people this. I remember, it's one of those things you remember the news story where you were when you heard it. I was in my car driving home, and on NPR, listening to the local affiliate VPR, there's an interview with a guy, head of the Pew Charitable Trust, and he had just come off a week or a number of days anyway, having been at this national, if not, it was a national convention where every nonprofit was invited to attend. And why did they all get together? It was a discussion across all these nonprofits, United Way, Pew, U.S. PERG, all these organizations, NRDC, you name it, they were there. Steep decline in donations. And they were corporate donations that were in steep decline. Why? Well, it was explained. Reagan started the movement. H.W. Bush didn't do so much. Then Bill Clinton, he was Reagan on steroids. Again, Democrat,
yeah.
Lefty, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
He and the Democrats pushed through tax policy, tax reform, as if it were bad before, that basically removed a significant amount of tax liability for corporations, gave them all these loopholes and outs.
Sure.
So all the big corporations, the polluters, right?
Yeah.
And the good ones, and they no longer had liability that they needed to write off. So they used to have a choice. Okay, I either pay the federal government $500 million in taxes on our profits, our windfalls this year, or I donate to various nonprofits, United Way, Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders, you name your cause, and 501c3, and you at least get credit. You're still losing that revenue from your,
sure.
It's not going in your coffers, but it wouldn't anyway. But then you get little plaque, you get credit, you can brag that you have a green agenda, you use it to sell your product. It was a marketing. You put
Absolutely. A lot of people doing this now.
Sticker on your cereal box, whatever. But no longer do they need to do that because there was no liability or an increasingly less amount that they had to pay Uncle Sam. So these nonprofits were taking it on the chin. They were hurting. So they had this conference, and I remember the NPR interviewer asking, so what were the outcomes? They said, well, it's still in play. We're coming up with new strategies, unique ideas. Well, you know what those were? They took the conflict of interest policies, every one of them. They ripped them up. They lit them on fire. They ran them into the trash incinerator. The green ones maybe recycled that paper.
Sure.
But those policies went out the window. And to a number, every single one of them, suddenly you had all these corporations, GM and Monsanto, maybe not Monsanto, but DuPont.
Which is a subsidiary of Monsanto, am I wrong? Or the other way around?
No, they're another chemical company. But all these companies that they used to revile, GE, it's unbelievable. And then they came up with these as they became more and more indebted to these organizations, where they felt it got too close, they cooked up these nonprofits. So they had these corporations like GE, who has an interest in wind turbines, right? Big wind turbine manufacturer.
Yeah.
But they also build jet aircraft and jet aircraft engines. We know what they do with those things, with bomber planes and Stryker planes. So
Talk about pollution.
suddenly, well, maybe that's too close. We don't want them on our board. So what they do is they created these nonprofits where these environmental groups, in quotations, are on the board, and these corporations are on the board, and they dump all this money into this pot, and then they give grant awards to green organizations to carry out their green agenda. Well, it's all about building renewable energy projects. So they give all the grants. There are a number of the ones up here got grants from, like, forget the name of the organization. My boss, Annette Smith, would know. And they gave grants to these organizations, which, there was basically greenwashed money. But it was, money that they would never have taken because it came from the manufacture of technologies and chemicals and, destroying the environment and, mistreating communities. And they don't care anymore. There's this plausible deniability. Oh, we took it from a nonprofit called the Green Fund or whatever it's called. I'm making up. That's a made up name.
The Green Fund.
But something like that.
Sure.
And so they take that money willingly, and they use it to do good things. And then if you press them on that, if you happen to have, well, wouldn't you rather have us take that money from them so they can't spend it on bad things, John? We're turning their money against them. We're doing green things that and we're educating them. So when you talk about how these people are on your board, well, you got to allow them to come back to the fold. And if they're doing the right thing, we've taught them how to do the right thing.
Talk about mental gymnastics.
So why do you want to penalize them when they finally are doing the right thing?
Yeah.
It's awful.
Well, that's the argument I hear all the time in the Vermont State House. Unfortunately, it's like, oh well, if we don't do this, then somebody else is
there was
going
a guy,
to. And it's like you can't seem to get around that mentality.
There is a guy, a Vermont family. I'm going to use their name because I have no respect for him and her. The wife, last I knew, was on the VPIRG board, but she may no longer be. But the husband had been on the VPIRG board. His name is Jeff Wolf. And being on the board, somehow their daughter got hired by VPIRG as a lobbyist. Coincident.
Yeah, right. Of course.
And they started this solar company, which got sold out. I forget the name. Sunward Solar. I can't remember the name of them. And they got bought out by some big corporation, and they got all this money. Well, he leaves the VPIRG board right in time or near in time to him taking his job. Guess who he went to work for? This green guy, Shell Oil. He was going to teach Shell Oil about how to do the right thing. He was like their director of green energy or something.
Blows me away.
It was like BP, right? Beyond Petroleum.
Yeah.
They changed their
from
their
British
acronym.
Petroleum. Yeah.
Beyond Petroleum, because they started building wind turbines.
Well, am I not mistaken?
And solar.
They're like all of the large gas companies are doing this now. Like ExxonMobil, Shell, British Petroleum. They're all rebranding and trying to co-opt and corner this green market because they know, at least culturally, that's where people. Because to be honest, I think we all want to do something about the environment. We all want the planet to be a better, safer place for everything that lives here. But now they're kind of like refocusing and co-opting and recornering certain industries, and then claiming, oh well, this is what we're trying to do to make up for all the damage that we've done. But it's just a new form of pollution.
But if you look at the human rights violations of Dutch West Shell, tipping off paramilitaries funded by the U.S., shooting and murdering indigenous environmentalist peoples who are trying to protect, their rivers and their communities from ungodly pollution that would never be allowed here, turning a blind eye to that, it is just, to me, it's unbelievable what's going on. That they're turning a blind eye to what's going on in Congo. There was a recent slam piece, where Representative Scott Campbell slammed Annette Smith in the Caledonian Record just the other day, saying that, well, they're by opposing these renewable energy build-outs in Vermont, you're supporting fossil fuel companies by extension. And, we all know what they've done. In fact, the military-industrial complex is very much there to support their interests. Absolutely correct. But he leaves out the fact there was a recent coup in the Congo that was traced back to the U.S., and it was over mineral rights.
Right.
Why are these minerals so hot? They had a huge auction and gala this at this premier hotel in Congo a couple of years ago. You know, stiletto heels and gold bracelets and caviar and champagne for all these mining corporations and investors. I'm sure Musk guys were there, and to parcel out all these minerals that have yet to be developed are under rainforests. You know, the last rainforests that are there, protecting us against climate change.
Yeah, of course.
And climate change is not only carbon, but you know, reducing carbon emissions, but reducing emissions from the clearing of forest and that forest duff now volatilizing under the hot sun and desertification, and now the sun's beating down on raw land, which now superheats the environment. You know, they don't want to talk about it.
No.
And Scott Campbell in his piece forgot to mention that these green energy developers, these lithium battery, you know, battery powered car and energy projects are all heavily dependent on the mining of these minerals. A lot of child labor, a lot of human rights abuses, and a lot of environmental impacts from straight discharging the processing byproducts that if you were to do it in the United States, you'd be in jail for life. And these organizations would rightly fight them.
Yeah, they would.
But when the emissions are in China or Tibet or Mongolia or Congo or Chile, they don't care.
Why do you think it is they don't care?
Because they have an agenda. The agenda is to promote renewable energy technologies no matter what. And with abandon, because, and you know, it's because those people, whether they want to admit it to themselves, to the people in the mirrors or not, it's because they fund their now lucrative jobs. The people that used to work at VPERG, as I mentioned to you earlier, Matt Rubin, the good soul that he is, would write, and it's more than once, cover payroll, so they would not be in violation of federal and state law out of his own personal bank account. That's not what goes on now. They've got vacations and, you know, 6-digit salaries. They've got lucrative jobs now, and they don't want to give it up.
They're buying people, and
well, they don't. They're cushy now, man. Yeah. They got it made. They go to big dinners and Shelburne Farms and with big funders. Yeah. You know, they have Unilever representatives. You know, Unilever owns Ben & Jerry's.
That's right.
And for years, and now I guess they're trying to spin it off, but
they're trying to get rid of it.
But they're on their board. Unilever, my God, the environmental destruction. Go to Costa Rica. Yeah. They own like 60% of the jungle that's planted to palm plantations owned by Unilever, and it's the destruction there of habitat. I mean, I don't have to go down this path very far to tell you that they're not a good corporation.
No.
They're even bad to their own family members. And so how they justify this, and it goes on and on. Seventh Generation, last I knew was on there. I forget who owns them. Are they owned by Unilever too? They're owned by some big corporation.
I don't know, but I do know that they definitely have their hands in many environmental organizations and nonprofits.
And then they have, you know, they collaborate with Renewable Energy Vermont. This it's the Renewable Energy Chamber of Commerce. REV is the acronym.
Yeah.
I mean,
and it's the Renewable Energy Chamber of Commerce, but like
they sell themselves as an environmental group.
Yeah, well, and when you think of the Chamber of Commerce, by the way, it's like local businesses, small businesses, but these are ultimately like giant corporations.
Well, it's all the mix. They're all in the mix. They're little guys.
There are
a lot of good people that are members of REV. But, you know, the overarching interest of any industry is to lessen its financial outlay and maximize profits. That's what they do.
Yeah.
And how do you do that? You get regulatory requirements out of the way. They cost a lot of money to comply. So they've been busily working to eliminate regulatory requirements that these environmental groups put in play years ago. And that still, they've historically said we cannot give these up. And, you know, it's interesting. So here's a great anecdote. VPERG, the old VPERG, I call the great VPERG, the wonderful VPERG, got a law passed with the help of then Senator Elizabeth Reedy, true dyed in the wool environmentalists, got a law in place to regulate cell phone tower siting under Act 250, and they had this regulatory scheme put together where, because there's a visual impact and there's environmental impact and all this stuff, albeit compared to wind turbines, it pales in severe comparison. So what happened was the lobbyists for the wind turbine people are like, or the cell phone people, and I'm going to leave the name out because one of them I consider kind of a friend of mine, went up to the VPIRG reps and said, if you guys are you going to oppose this change in law that we're seeking, then I'm going to blow you guys away for hypocrisy, because you guys are doing everything in your power to cite and support these wind turbines, which are 350 feet in the air. The cell towers are 110 feet, and the wind turbines are across ridge lines, and these cell towers are just here and there, hit and miss. So suddenly VPIRG doesn't care about cell towers anymore. It's off their agenda. Just like I said, PFAS is a very minor concern. It's off there. They don't make money on that. And to really get into the fight on PFAS, you have to oppose renewable energy technology as it's being sold now. The lithium batteries, the insulating layers, and even the fluids in those batteries, or the chemicals in those batteries, include PFAS chemicals.
Wow.
Matt Chapman,
oh my goodness,
who's the head of now what used to be called the Waste Management Division. I forget what they call them now. But DEC's program that deals with hazardous and solid waste matters, as well as pollution prevention and public education on waste reduction matters. He testified this year in the House Natural Resources Committee on PFAS and all the issues since our wastewater treatment facility sludges, and the chair of the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee, Amy Sheldon, said, Mr. Chapman, why don't we just pass a law to ban PFAS, the selling of anything that contains PFAS in Vermont? We're going to be leaders. Why not? And Matt said, well, you should know that the renewable energy technologies are heavily dependent on PFAS, and to do that would eliminate their deployment. Boom. She goes, oh, I didn't know that. And this is this year, chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. I've sent her emails containing documents and studies all about containing all this back in the teens before COVID. She obviously never read it.
Or she did, and she just didn't care.
And, well, she asked that naive question.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
She didn't know.
She had no clue.
So this is how she only knows what is fed her by the lobbyists. So suddenly she went quiet. She didn't say, all of a sudden the public health issues, the environmental issues, apparently are of lesser concern, because she stopped pursuing the question. And
interesting.
Boom. This is what's going on in that State House. It is, and if you're cut from the old school environmental cloth, as I am, I'm the enemy of those people.
Yeah. I want to throw this out there too, as I've heard you, kind of tell a lot of your story here. I think it's interesting the terminology that you use to explain even the type of work, or the concerns, I guess, more so than anything, of like what the legislature is, and then the people ultimately surrounding it, the lobbyists, stakeholders of various kinds. Hearing you go from back in the 80s where you're talking about like pollution and contaminants and just like, the negative externalities of a lot of the stuff that we're using. And then as you get like into like, there's a point in our conversation where I asked like, what year was that? And it was like 2000s. And the reason I asked is because you started using the word climate. And I just think it's just interesting how what environmentalism has evolved into, or actually what they claim environmentalism has evolved to, as opposed to what it was maybe back when you were here, digging up the tank here at Bean Chevrolet and taking out. And it's very strange to me how now it's like, like I think as the Industrial Revolution has gone on and continued to evolve, it's like we all want a clean planet. We all want to have.
I'm not sure about that.
Well,
the regular people do.
The regular people do, and I think a lot of legislators
and we've been
do.
educated to want it.
I think a lot of legislators do too. I think like we all want that, but there's a lot of people, the ones that don't want it or don't care.
Well, what are we willing to give up to attain that?
Exactly, and that's where I wanted to. I was going to ask is like what does a clean planet look like, and what would it look like for us to? And this is a big philosophical question, I guess. What does a clean planet look like, and what would it take for us to get to that point, and what are we willing to give up, and are we willing to give up anything?
I'm going to diverge and then pull me back.
Okay.
I talked to you about that Pew Charitable Trust convention, and it was right after that, within a couple 3 years, that suddenly corporations had seats on all these organizations, Nature Conservancy, and then they were, so that was a major sea change. There was another major sea change event. When I was in graded school, high school, college, the big issue was population, because directly connected with overpopulation, I called the population boom. That's
Sure.
why we were called boomers.
Yeah.
Because the population boomed. And I was talking to my wife, we were walking the dog the other day. It actually didn't boom with the boomers, it boomed with my parents' generation, because the housing boom, where all the suburban sprawl was created in the, after World War II, with the federal mortgage guarantees and all that stuff, and the veterans benefits, college and all that.
Sure.
That all happened after World War II, and all this sprawl happened after World War II. The boomers had yet to be born or just in their infancy, but all this infrastructure was put into place, interstates and everything, to support the families that were raising the boomers. The interstates in Vermont being
absolutely
a case in point.
It was the late 50s. 50s, yeah,
50s,
60s,
early 50s.
Sure.
Banks could give out mortgages to people who had low incomes, blue collar people, and the feds would guarantee that they would get paid if the person defaulted, and control the interest rates and all that stuff. My parents took out a loan, a vet's loan, 2% to build their house.
Wow.
In 1955. So anyway, we understood, and there was no left and right on this issue. There are all these black and white films that talk about air pollution. They talk about overpopulation and, all this going on. And it became, the environmental movement was about population, concern about overpopulation and overtaxing the capacity of the planetary environment to address all the demands placed upon it by human existence, modern society. And so there was this movement, ZPG, zero population growth. I remember the button, ZPG. And, that was the lead issue. And from that, everything else flowed. Factories, manufacturing shoes and goods and discharging the dyes into the rivers of New England, the textile industry.
We did that right here.
That was to support our modern population, and all the chemicals. I mentioned Woburn, Mass, W.R. Grace, DuPont, you name it, Monsanto, and of course the military-industrial complex. All that was inextricably linked to our population, and the greater the population, the more demands would be placed upon the environment through consumption. And so that was, growth was the concern. But what happened was the environmental groups, suddenly the corporations, when they realized after the Clean Air Act passed, corporations didn't care. And then they realized they started having to get permits, and they couldn't get permits. They had to put scrubbers on. They're like, oh my God. So then they passed the Clean Water Act. And at that point, they tried to stop it. So Nixon administration went from being in strong support, creating the EPA, to trying to stop it, but it became law, the Clean Water Act, thank God. So the environmental organizations, that was part of the inextricable from their agenda, was dealing with population growth and consumption. So, but they now had this new enemy, and that was corporate America. Corporate America didn't know what an environmental law was or what its impacts would be. They had no concern until the Clean Air Act got put into operation, and then the Clean Water Act just added to their headache. So now they had this enemy, and they had to really tool up because now they're embattled. Before they were just good guys. Nobody wants to dump trash in the lake. Nobody wants pollution in Lake Erie.
Sure.
And kids dying people getting sick from Love Canal. So that's when they started tooling up NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, and all these CLF, came into being or geared up.
Can you say CLF again? I'm sorry. The
CLF is Conservation Law Foundation.
Okay.
It's a New England, basically environmental advocacy organization that's basically is a litigate. They litigate. They're a litigative firm, nonprofit, as is NRDC.
Okay.
They're like a environmental law firm.
Okay.
And so they had to expand into these areas. So they knew they had this quote unquote set of adversaries, and that was corporate America, right, and the military-industrial complex. Well, then as population control became part of the rhetoric, the Christian right started under Reagan and Nancy Reagan started rising in power, Falwell and all those guys, and they started increasingly becoming part of the political conversation and wielding increasing amounts of political sway. And like that Pew Charitable Trust conference, there was a gathering of all these environmental groups to a number. And they're like, you know what? That saying, Charlie Bristow said, up to our ass and my ass in alligators. They were up to their asses in alligators already with corporate America. But now they had the Christian right saying, to be an environmentalist is to be pro-abortion, because that's how you get population control. There are many other ways.
That's what they were.
So they were.
Wow.
So suddenly the corporations in the Christian right were teaming up, and so now they had like, oh my God, data coming from all directions. So they consciously decided we are no longer going to discuss population control or overpopulation and the attendant consumption. And it's like they will not say it. They will not say it. You try to approach any environmental organization head and talk about overpopulation on the record, they will not talk about it.
Right now.
Right now.
No, they don't want to go there.
They have been schooled. Do not say that, because they're afraid they'll get assailed and they'll lose donors and the Pope and all this stuff. So they don't. So they've turned that corner too, and so now they're so far away from their original roots that they're like, it's almost like if you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah. Yeah.
They love to slam. They without any basis, which is, it's all fraudulent rhetoric, but they'll say, oh, Vermonters for a clean environment. They're not a green organization, not an environmental organization. Actually, we're like VPIRG used to be. We're a street fighting organization. We engage the citizenry. It's not top down. And we are a public interest group that makes sure that we are always acting in the public interest and not corporate interests or private sector interests. But these environmental organizations have decided that, well, you can't beat them, join them. But they'll say that VCE, my organization, Vermonters for a Clean Environment, is taking money from dark money from the Koch brothers, which, man, I'd be making bank. I make $45,000 a year, folks, with no benefits. I don't make much money.
You do what you do.
Ask them to disclose what their salaries are.
They
will not. In fact, I had this conversation with a leader of one of those organizations, and after accusing me of being a climate denier, and I say, no, I actually think you are, because I think it's 100 times worse.
Yeah.
What, me? What? Yeah, it's 100 times worse. Well, why would we do that? Because all these initiatives you guys are pressing for will not be a drop in a bucket of water in terms of its net effect. We have to reduce our consumption.
Was this Paul Burns you're speaking of?
I'm not going to mention.
Oh, okay.
Who that is. So, so we've been accused of that. But then you try to bring to their attention, as a colleague of mine, James Ellers, recently sent an email containing documentation that the Koch brothers actually is the largest, one of the largest suppliers, the largest supplier of high quality glass that's used in solar panel manufacture in this country, and one of the largest in the world. They're the enemy. They found an enemy, right? So then when you tell them that, well, the glass in the solar panels that you support being manufactured that and deployed by the corporations that populate your boards, those solar panels are in part manufactured with products from Koch Industries. They don't want to talk about it.
Nope. Of course not.
So, and you could argue by extension, if you're purchasing these products that then fund this aspect of Koch Industries, you're helping them profit, and then those profits are used in ways that run contrary to your stated interests, publicly stated interests, because they constantly deride the Koch brothers. But they have no problem with goods that are manufactured with their products. They don't like 3M or DuPont, but they have no problem with the PFAS that are used and sprayed on the back panels of the solar, the blackened panels on the back so solar panels can do their job. That's all PFAS paint. They have no problem with PFAS in lithium battery technology. They say, these people are wrong. This mining is only for till now, till we get the lithium that we need mined, the copper we need mined, and then it's infinitely recyclable. Oh, so you're going to recycle those lithium batteries? How are you going to separate the PFAS? And what are you going to do with that PFAS? Do you have a plant that's going to be able to destruct that PFAS, which will, by the way, take immense amounts of energy to get to 2,250 degrees Fahrenheit? How are we going to do that?
And they don't have they don't have any.
You're going to do that with solar panels and wind technology? I mean, are you kidding me? And you try to have productive conversation, not cynical gotcha stuff. They will not sit down with you. They will not discuss this. And if you get anywhere down this path, they call you a climate denier.
That's their favorite phrase.
Yeah. And no. You guys are in denial about what's going on.
So we have been going for about 2.5 hours. I'm happy to keep going because I know there's a story that you have that you when you were, it was under the Shumlin administration, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And you've talked a little bit about me before, but I think this is an important one, especially because it's still relevant. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? What exactly is the story there? I know that you were involved in, at this point it was not the trash incinerator. It's way beyond that.
No, this is renewable energy technology. This is wind turbines.
Wind turbines.
So I worked at A&R, and what I haven't mentioned is I became very active in the state employees labor unions called Vermont State Employees Association, VSEA. And I was a shop steward, which basically means I was the worksite representative of the union. And you, like with any union, you have a union contract that has pay and benefits, and it has workplace standards that are agreed upon, developed in collaboration with the employer. And you will put in an 8-hour workday. You get a half an hour lunch. You get you get these benefits. You'll get paid mileage. You'll get paid overtime. All this stuff is wrapped into this contract, and there are sections in that contract which have to do with employee rights and rights of process. So if you get illegitimately or legitimately charged with misconduct in the work site, there are procedures and policies and procedures that are in that contract that are implemented to getting rid of bad problem employees and to protecting good employees that they might, witch hunt for telling the truth, has happened to me numerous times since 1992. Numerous times. Peter Shumlin was Senator Shumlin. He knew me very well because he was a green senator. And, they all loved me. Everyone loves a whistleblower until they're working for you. Every administration loves the whistleblowers, and different than what I've attended a number of conferences on this, and they always tell you have no obligation to tell your boss to give them a heads up. I felt ethically obligated, particularly out of my experience working with my friend Elizabeth McLean, she didn't know what she was being told was wrong. And so I always make an effort to work inside. In fact, working with other colleagues, we came up with this process. What was the name of that team? We have a committee that, and I think it's still going on, that meets with the commissioner of DEC, and it was basically to give them heads up. You had a rep from each program in DEC, and just kind of give them fair warning. This is what's going on, and your directors aren't going to tell you because they have a reason, because they're up in the hierarchy and they just only want to tell you good things.
Sure.
And everything's going great, and so when am I going to get that promotion?
Yeah.
So they call it the Pulse team. Pulse on the agenda, and so the directors actually opposed the formation of this team. But they did a test run under Howard Dean's administration. This guy, Bill Brierley, did it, and they came to like it because we tell them, this is what directors are doing, and they're not telling you. And the directors would be pissed, but the commissioner would say, well, is it true? Well, yeah, but why didn't you tell me that? Well, so we became increasingly valuable because we would keep people from whistleblowing. And my agenda was to stop whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is a last-ditch effort. It's the nuclear option.
Yeah.
Employees don't want to do that.
No. Because
And
then
so
there's
many
consequences for it.
I told you about employees don't do that. Whistleblow generally. Doesn't mean because things are good. They want up quitting. Your best employees quit, and then your worst employees stay. It's this culling process.
Yeah.
So this winnowing, you winnow down to lazy employees instead of the good ethical ones who want to go in for work for environmental organizations or something.
Yeah.
So you train them up and then they leave because or they feel so beleaguered they retire early, or they start leaking stuff, and then the commissioners get whacked because they didn't know what was going on. So we had this Pulse committee. And so we put in these internal processes to try to improve the work environment for not only employees, but the appointees. So the DEC would fly straight as they could. And, our best commissioner on this, believe it or not, again, a Republican, Jeff Wenberg, under Douglas. When he got appointed, and I had some sway with the transition team in getting him hired, the people inside found out about Jeff Wenberg, who was former mayor of Rutland, who was seen as the antichrist to the environmental movement, and they thought he was going to come in and fire everybody. Staff would not talk to me. I knew Jeff better than that. I knew him to be ethical. We might disagree. All I want is someone ethical and consistent. And if you give them the facts, they'll make the right decision. That's what ethics are. You can have leanings and understandings, but then given the same set of facts, you should have the same end or within range kind of decisions should flow from that fact set when looking at the law. And Jeff proved to be amazing and defended staff and wouldn't allow this stuff to go on. He ultimately left his job because of him being such a good advocate for the environment and following the law. And, he had to leave. And I won't go down that path much further, but he was amazing. And the same staff that reviled me for him getting hired at the annual meeting where he gave his kind of swan song presentation to staff, like to a number, those same people were crying. They loved him so much. I mean, he was that great. He's now moved to Virginia. But so Shumlin, he knew who I was. I was a known quantity to that legislature. And so now here's a guy who loved the whistleblower when he was, putting out information that embarrassed Howard Dean or embarrassed Jim Douglas.
Sure.
But now he's governor. Like, uh-oh. And so he was like texting me. We had each other's cell phone number. I gave him like a Christmas gift during the transition team. I saw him running. He lived in my neighborhood. He lived in East Montpelier. I live in Calais. He used to run past my farm with his fiance. We were friends. And so I was looking forward to him as governor. But Deb Markowitz got in office. He got appointed. And definitely not the brightest bulb on the circuit.
So what position?
A&R secretary.
Okay.
And she said things because when she was Secretary of State previously, she was known as someone who would target employees who didn't. You either agree or I'm going to figure a way. She literally at a staff meeting when she was Secretary of State said to staff, "Okay, so we've covered everything we need to cover. I just want to let you know I'm running for re-election. And as you leave the office, I got signs for you to put up on your lawn and bumper stickers that you can hand out. And so a woman on staff said, Deb, Secretary of State's office, of all places, you cannot have that conversation. You can't bring your personal politics into this office. We're neutral on politics. We advise on elections. And she is like, starts yelling at this woman, oh, you just don't like me, you know. And this guy, and she started assailing this woman, and this guy said, no. And Deb, those signs should not be outside the door, and you need to remove them. So she got up and, gathered up her marbles and went back to her office. So that was like 2 PM. And then I was told at like 4:30, staff walk out, and she was greeting them at the end of the driveway and stopping their cars and trying to hand them lawn signs and bumper stickers and buttons and campaign material. And so this guy and this woman happen to be carpool when they get out, and they say, you can't do this, Deb. If someone sees this, I'm trying to protect you. Well, lo and behold, she doesn't come in. That's on Friday. She doesn't come into work on Monday. I can only conjecture where she went. I'll bet you it was at the personnel department. And on Tuesday, she brought personnel actions against the guy and that woman and ultimately drove them out of their jobs. I knew this because I was a union shop steward.
Wow.
So under Shumlin, there was testimony. Oh, let me back up. Under Douglas, there was testimony before what was then called the Public Service Board. It's been renamed the Public Utility Commission. There was testimony provided by Eric Sorensen, a wildlife biologist at Fish and Wildlife, and John Austin, another wildlife biologist at Fish and Wildlife, as well as testimony from the head attorney for the Public Service Department that this project being proposed by Green Mountain Power, what's known as the Lowell Wind Project, Kingdom Community Wind is its official name, would have an undue impact on the environment and didn't meet environmental standards by ANR. There were all these reasons. And there was this testimony under oath. And the term is undue. And here's the rationale backing up what undue is. In the audience is John Groveman, who at that time was counsel at VNRC. In the audience is Green Mountain Power officials. At the table with Green Mountain Power's attorneys is Sandy Levine, who's the attorney for CLF, sitting side by side with Green Mountain Power's attorney. And John Page, Guy Page's brother, was president of the Green Mountain Club at the time, and he was a witness in those hearings. There were 2 sets of hearings. One was held in November, and there was another in February, November of 2010. That's when Shumlin got elected. And then in February of 2011, while Shumlin's in office, Deb Markowitz is Secretary of ANR. And guess who's general counsel at ANR? Conflict of interest? John Groveman. He worked at VNRC, and they had a position staked out on this project and had weighed in on this project. Kim Greenwood, their hydrogeologist, had weighed in, filed testimony while John was their counsel. Now he's general counsel under Markowitz, being privy to all this information at VNRC, having staked out a position, right or wrong, an advocacy stake on this project. And he's now supposed to be representing the public in his role as counsel to ANR and to Markowitz. The secretary of ANR under Douglas met during the transition period with Deb Markowitz, and he wanted to show her, okay, this is where the pencils and papers are kept. This is how the copy machine works. Sure. This is what you do. This is trying to show her the ropes to smooth the transition as they do. And he said to me, all she wanted to talk about was Lowell Wind. How can I get that permitted? And John's like, well, our staff already testified that it can't get permits because it doesn't meet all these standards. And it would have a huge impact on the environment, negative impact. And she goes, well, I need to permit, according to Jonathan Wood, told to me directly, I need to get this thing permitted. And he goes, well, you can't. You'd be violating the law. And she goes, yes, I can. So fast forward, it's now January, February. I'm a union shop steward. I don't work on wind turbines. I now am running the salvage yard program. And in comes one staff person after another in my office. When can I meet with you? And I used to work late, so they'd come in when everyone went away, and they wouldn't see them come in my office 6, 7 o'clock at night, crying. They're being told to push through these wetland permits. They're being told to ignore Class A stream protections and just allow them to fill it in with debris, just like they do with the coal mine in mountaintop coal mine destruction.
Sure.
They fill in the streams below. That's exactly what they did with the low wind. They blew everything off and filled in the streams so they could put these roads up. Decimated, blew off the mountaintop, flattened it. I mean, decimated the environment up there. So they're saying this is what they're being told to do, and I'm getting the feeling that if I don't write these permits, I'm going to get fired. And I said, write the permits. I'll deal with this from the outside. So when I worked at the union, and I was on a number of boards and committees, I came to know Beth Robinson. She became ultimately Supreme Court Justice in Vermont. She's now a federal court judge appointed by, who appointed her? Shumlin? I think Shumlin. I don't know who. Oh, no, it's federal. It would have been Leahy or recommended her.
Okay.
So, and she had done a white paper, a legal argument. They were trying to not pay. They were trying to eliminate our pensions, state employee pensions. And so the union had hired her to do a legal analysis about the approach the legislature was trying to do. I mean, our pension program was it was really hurting. It was during the crash. So all of a sudden the Democrats were trying to take it out on the employees, having not put the money in which they were required to do under law, having violated the law. Susan Bartlett, Peter Shumlin, when they were senators. So anyway, she wrote this paper that it's basically, yes, it's under statute and you can change the statute, but there's a contractual obligation in law that you'd be in breach of to all the existing employees, and they can and they will file a lawsuit and you will lose. And the legislature oh, yeah, I guess better not do that.
Yeah.
So they got to the table, and Jeb Spalding was treasurer, and we worked it out. Now Spalding's Secretary of Administration under Shumlin. I'm, again, a shop steward. I'm hearing all these grievances. Beth Robinson, this woman who later became Vermont Supreme Court Justice, was counsel to Governor Shumlin. And I had a connection with her. So I called her up. And I said, Beth, can I talk to you about some stuff? And I went to her office. And I laid out the law and the laws that were in potential breach that we were staff were being pressed to violate. There was a thing that John Groveman cooked up, General Counsel to A&R, former VNRC General Counsel, and now the water director at VNRC, the revolving door, right? John Groveman cooked up this deal. So what they did was, when Shumlin got into office, Groveman went and sat down with the staff and said, we need to give them a permit. Because the PUC has the Public Service Board has independent discretion. And yes, A&R can plead its case, but in the end, we're going to lose,
Sure.
Which is not true. They did it on Deerfield when they could do it here. But A&R behaved differently in Deerfield Wind than they did here. They were very strong in their position, and DPS, Department of Public Service, was against it. So in comes Shumlin. CLF sidled up next to Green Mountain Power. Hearings in February. There are reporters. You had mentioned Chelsea Green.
Yeah.
There was a guy who ultimately became a editor or worked for Chelsea Green, Shay Totten. He used to report for, I don't know, Digger and other small publications up in Chittenden County. Vermont Digger, I think, being one of them. There was the Vanguard, I think I remember, 7 Days. So anyway, I think he was working for 7 Days at the time, and he started doing public records requests for applications. They needed to get stormwater permits. They needed to get stream alteration permits. This is Green Mountain Power.
Yeah.
For Kingdom Community Wind. They needed to get wetlands mitigation permits, conditional use determination. They needed to get this myriad of permits. And so Shay Totten, journalist Shay Totten, asked for these records, and they refused to give him these records. They said they're not public. And he's like, they're applications, It's someone next door to your house wants to put a septic system in. I have a right to review that application. And John Groveman came up with this novel bullshit legal argument. It's total bull. And by the way, this is what I talked to Beth Robinson about when she was counsel to Governor Shumlin. That was, we signed an agreement with Green Mountain Power. We cut a deal. This is a regulating agency. It's supposed to be neutral and protect and follow the law and apply the law in a neutral way for everybody the same way, not favoring Green Mountain Power or Joe's gas station or anybody.
Sure.
But like with the waste incinerator, here we go again. And guess what? Under a Democratic administration, I started scratching my head. What is going on here? They're the ones who are supposed to be better on the environment. And I keep coming into conflict with the Democratic administrations in terms of applying the law judiciously. They will not follow the law. It's unbelievable. And, I tried to talk to, like I do, Markowitz and Groveman. They would not talk to me. So I went to Beth Robinson. I said, this is what they've done. Groveman said, under the public records law, there are exemptions to what can be required of state government to disclose. Documents that are part of pending litigation, documents that are part of ongoing contractual discussions. So he said, and documents related to contractual discussions. He said, well, by virtue of Green Mountain Power signing an agreement with us that if we assured them of this permit, whether or not it met standards, they would agree to purchase and conserve 3,000 acres somewhere else. Basically, you can devastate this area as long as you protect that area.
Sure.
Environment be damned. Citizens neighboring it, be damned. Fish, wildlife, be damned. Brook trout, be damned. Invasive species invading the upper watershed forest lands, what were forest lands, be damned. So he said, every single application for every permit and every approval requested by Green Mountain Power is intimately connected to this memorandum of understanding, which is really a contract. And under the law, it says we can exempt from public disclosure records related to negotiation of a contract. So they refused to provide Shay Totten and any other member of the public what are normally in public record. Yeah. AOT gets a permit to fill a wetland, and you like, oh my God, that feeds the trout stream that I fly fish in. You have a right to see that. Well, if it was related to this project, they would have said no. So I went to Beth Robinson about this. I sat down in her office. She's like, oh my God. And I brought the law books with me, the green books. I said, hey, see, had to regulate, see. She's like, John, this is not my area of expertise. Everything you're telling me is so complex. I said, but you understand, if the law says this, if the law says no, the answer is no. If the law says yes, given these conditions, it can be yes. Blinking yellow light. Or definitely yes, you meet these requirements. And she said, let me call John Groveman. I said, you tell him what I said to you.
Sure. She
contacts John Groveman at A&R not after our meeting, and she calls me back. She said, and I said, by the way, he's going to lie and tell you John doesn't know what he's talking about and he's not a lawyer. I promise you he'll say that. You don't need to be a lawyer to read law. And if you had to be a lawyer to understand and read law and follow law, then they could not charge you with murder because those laws can only be read by attorneys. So only attorneys could be charged with murder, right? Or trespass, sure, or theft. Let's go rob banks and shoot the guard. Not really. No. Don't do that, folks. So it's the most ludicrous argument, but that's what they all do, these arrogant Vermont law school creeps. John Groveman didn't go to Vermont Law School, by the way. But so sure enough, Beth said she'd call me back after she spoke with John. Yep, I spoke with him. I said, what'd he say? Well, he said exactly what you said he'd say. And he said that we think we're right on the law. And I said, well, Beth, as I said, if that's the case, I said, this is what he's going to say. If that's the case, we agreed that we'll sit down with him. Let's have a meeting. She said, he said he won't meet with you. I said, think about that, Beth. I'm not an attorney. He's all knowing. He knows what the law is. You're counsel to the governor. And he will not meet with me. Some dummy who doesn't understand the law. She goes, yeah, I did find that pretty odd. And I said, well, we need to talk. She goes, well, there's something else I have to talk to you about. This will be our last conversation. And I'm like, oh, so you're getting shut down? She goes, no, it's something else. You'll be hearing about it tomorrow. Okay. I get off the phone. Remember, again, where that conversation was. I get off the phone. The next day, it's announced that she's been tapped to be Vermont Supreme Court Justice. It was minutes after that, boom, they're investigating me. Why? Because I met with general counsel or counsel to the governor, because I laid out the law as it stood and blew smoke in their faces about blowing off the law. So long and short, it went on for 2 years. It was harassment beyond belief. But it gave me time to assemble all the records I needed. I copied every single document I ever printed out. Every single file was on my computer. Everything. Correspondence with my bosses, with them. And they ultimately walked me out the door one day, and under false charges. And they ultimately fired me. And so there's a process where you can challenge, you can appeal your dismissal. And I had heard through the Vine that the counsel, the attorney at the Department of Personnel at the time, they call it Department of Human Resources, told Deb Markowitz, look, whether or not you have the grounds, just make something up. Just put something together just that, is somewhat believable.
Jeez.
And fire him. And 99% of these cases result in settlement. You can just give him what he wants, and you'll have gotten rid of him. Well, I found out about that, and it made it up to the governor's office, and they canned this attorney. They didn't fire him, they moved him. So that's another story. But this is how things work. And I did sign a settlement agreement because these judges, you don't know, there are a number of appointments to the Vermont Labor Relations Board, which is where the appeals of your dismissals are heard. And, it's 3 judges. 2 out of 3 could have been Shumlin appointments. And you know how they work at this legislature.
Mm-hmm.
We know how they work at A&R.
Yes.
For me to think that these people are oh so pure and neutral and, put my future in jeopardy, I settled. But they wanted a gag order, which I did not agree to.
Meaning,
they said, okay, we'll give you everything you want, but you can't talk about it, which, by the way, is illegal. I'm a public official. Everything I know was gained while being in the employ of the citizens of the state of Vermont, and that's all public knowledge. And to constrain me from what is in the public record, whether it's in my brain or not, from discussing any of that, is illegal. And my attorney, this wonderful attorney, Norm Blay, who represented me in this appeal, said, well, I talked to the Attorney General's office, who handles these appeals. And he said, John, trust me, you got to sign that gag order. I said, oh, I'll be in breach of it in 10 minutes because I can't keep my mouth shut. And then where does that lead us? Back into court. And, that's a whole nother mess. I don't want to get tangled up. I said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'd rather go to the Labor Relations Board. And by the way, I was able to pierce, there's a veil of protection. And this is where the wonderful Governor Scott comes in. He was key, as were a few other witnesses. They claimed that they dismissed me because I did all these bad things, which are all fake. For instance, they said I ran up thousands of dollars in phone bills on my state cell phone. Well, when I got the state cell phone, the first thing they told me in training me, I'd never had an iPhone before, showed me how to use it. They said, by the way, this is the way the plans worked, commercial plans back then. If you use the phone only for calling other cell phones, cell to cell communication, there's no charge to the state. Now, what do I care? And they said, and it's free no matter who you call after 5 on weekends. Well, if that would be for personal use.
Yeah.
Everyone was using state cell phones for personal use. So they charged me illegally using for personal use and running up thousands of dollars in cell phone costs. Well, I was still working there, and I knew what they were up to because they investigated, and I was part of this investigative proceeding. I could see what they were doing. So I put a suit and tie on, cut my hair, cut my own hair, trimmed my mustache, put on my suit, and I went and had scheduled a meeting with the guy from the cell phone company. And I said, I had this program, and this is my phone number. And he looked it up. He goes, yep, you're part of this phone pool. And I said, I've been told, I'm just trying to understand the plan because I've been told that, I may have exceeded some minutes, and, I want to make sure that we're on the right plan and we're doing things right. He said, oh, no, there's no cost to you. Don't worry about it. You didn't cost the state anything. Well, no, I've been told that. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Can you explain it to me? He explained it to me. He printed it out. Turns out cell to cell is free. But the way they used to write up the invoice, they would invoice the state, and they say, so John Brabant's cell phone to for whatever it was. I can't remember the number anymore. 595. Can't remember it anymore. They'd ring it up, and they'd say, 300 minutes at 10 cents a minute. That's, was that $30? And then that's $30 every pay period. That's so 10 for a year. That's $300. John stole $300. So they'd say 300 minutes, and then so that would be the subtotal. And then then it would say, okay, they're on state plan B1. Oh, which calls were cell to cell? 100% of them. So they'd back out the $30, and then it would zero out. So what they did was they took a paper cutter, they printed out all those cell phone invoices, and they cut the bottom off, and they said, see, and you didn't pay for this. Well, we also had a process internally that if you ran up a phone bill on the landline, they would give you the printout, and they'd say, you got to pay this. They stopped giving me the printouts. Everyone else got the printouts. They didn't give me the printouts.
When did they stop giving you the printouts?
Well, when they were investigating me.
So
So I couldn't
just
have
wanted to
known.
double check.
I could have known. Then they said I wasn't putting all my hours in, but I could prove it using the records they provide. I said, no, they misrepresented the hours. And I said, by the way, I worked on weekends because I had to work, and nights I had to work with select boards. Well, how come it's not on your timesheets? I said, because we were banned from putting in overtime. So my boss, the guy who wrote up this report, told me keep a separate record. And just so you can keep track of your hours. I said, here's the record. And he claimed he never told me all this stuff. But, it was actually protocol, what other employees are told to do. So it was easy argument to make. And I had those printouts of all the invoices. So when the Attorney General's office deposed me, now, state employee, they claimed I was a low-level state employee. I was crying foul, saying Shumlin was out to get me. And I made claims that I met with the governor's counsel, and knowing I couldn't have access to Supreme Court justice now, nor did they. That's all fraudulent. But there's case law that they were relying on. When Governor Coonan was governor, she directly fired an employee inappropriately, a high-level employee, without cause, or proper cause, which is law.
Was it her employee for the cabinet?
I don't remember exactly. She wasn't cabinet. She was lower, but she didn't like what this employee did their job, kind of like me.
Yeah. And
she got embarrassed because she did something wrong, and so she went after the employee. That's what they all do.
Instead of just looking within and saying,
right.
Maybe it's me.
Well, she made the mistake. She did this a lot of times. All governors, I would too.
Yeah.
But you'll go after the employee. You say, mea culpa, man, I did it. So this employee went to court, said, I'm going to court and challenging my dismissal, and I want Governor Coonan on the stand because I can prove that she dismissed me. She had some record proving it. And So the governor, the AG's office represents the governor, went to court saying, no, the governor's protected. There's a protection, executive privilege protection. You can't put the governor on the stand. And the Vermont Supreme Court issued this amazingly well thought out, well articulated decision. It said, well, that's generally the case, but if the governor or any high level official, secretary or above, is directly involved in either the conversations or in the decision making,
Yeah.
they can then be subpoenaed because they're decision making. You have a right to face your accuser on the stand at the Labor Relations Board. Boom, like Charity Clark did. Settlement. This woman got a great settlement, I understand. And Keenan didn't have to go on the stand. Well, so I was looking for that. And we deposed my boss, and he got caught lying. And the AG was on the other side of the table, and he was their key witness, which his report had all these holes. He also had been brought up on contempt of court charges because he was a Chittenden State's attorney, assistant state's attorney, and he had created fraudulent records to prosecute DUI prosecutions. He had fabricated records, and he got caught, and he was brought to the Vermont bar, and he had his license suspended for I don't know how long. And he wound up at A&R as a lowly attorney in the enforcement division. Why? Because his bosses knew he had done that, and so he had the goods on them. So they're like, okay, we'll move you over here. You're an attorney. You can't go to court because you've been not disbarred, but had your license suspended, and you can do this until you regain your license. That's how he wound up coming and ultimately becoming my boss, which is horrible. So I knew about this, and there's all microfiche on this, and he was above the crease in the Burlington Free Press in 1993, having done this. It was a major story in Chittenden County, like 30 counts of contempt of court, fabricating records, breathalyzer records, calibration records.
Wow.
We can get into detail.
Yeah, just for what reason was he doing? Who was he trying to?
Okay, I'll tell you. There was a federal program under, who would have been? H.W. Bush?
93 and Clinton?
Well, it started earlier.
Okay.
And then Clinton. And it was a grant program. They're trying to get drunks off the road. You know, remember the Moms Against Drunk Driving, MAD? Yeah. It was all spawned by that. So Congress passed this law, and the administration provided all these grants to fund police forces and task forces. So Chittenden County put together a task force with the Chittenden State's Attorney's Office, working with the local police departments, Burlington cops, state police. And among other things, they funded this task force, but they also provided equipment, and they provided this breathalyzer called a Data Master breathalyzer machine. And you were required, like so many of these analyzers, like the ones I used to analyze the tank pull in front of this building here many years ago, they have to be calibrated regularly. And in order for this thing to hold up in court, the readings of the person's breath, hold up in court, you have to calibrate it before each day's use.
Okay.
And you use what they call a calibration gas. And so you plug this canister of gas, and the gas is kept in the box that the machine is sold in. And you plug it into the machine, you set it for the calibrations, like early computerized stuff. And you set it, and you run the gas through it. And it should say, whatever, what percentage? 1% blood alcohol, or 0.01 blood alcohol level, and that's what it should read. If it reads high, you adjust it down to 0.01. If it reads low, you adjust it up, and then when you're done, it's got a printer, and it prints out this slip, calibration record, and that's supposed to go into your records, and you keep that record. So when you pull someone over, and pull John Brabant over, and you think he's been drinking, and he blows numbers, and you throw him in jail, and now you're prosecuting for the crime of driving while under the influence, you then, when challenged in court, can say, yep, I breathalyzed him, and this is the proof. I got a 0.01 or 0.015 or something. And they could say, well, how do I know that meter was properly calibrated? Here's the printout. Well, guess what? They never taught the police how to calibrate it, and that they should calibrate it. They just gave them the machines.
And then they just went around.
None of them were calibrating. They were pulling people over, and they may have been 100% right. They may have been reading low, and he was really letting people off, but they may have been reading high. We don't know.
So there's some people that probably got screwed over.
Yep. And so you cannot know. So this attorney was representing a guy who blew numbers, was put on the stand, and my boss, Gary Kessler, from the Mad River Valley, who runs all those bike contests down there, and was doing so on state time, by the way. That's another thing we got him on.
Classic.
And I could prove it. He was the lead attorney. He liked to be in charge. He was always climbing that ladder to get the recognition and pay. He was like the head of this program, this task force. And so he prosecuted the cases. So he's in criminal court, and this attorney says, I want to see he's looking at the record for the how they got the goods on his client, and he said, I want a copy of the booklet. This is before the internet, and the manufacturers, how to booklet, how to run it, how to do everything, operator's manual. And Kessler, my boss, when he was in this role, opposed, said that's private, that's confidential. And the judge is like, and this guy's like, well, how do I know whether the guy operated it correctly until I know? So when I interviewed a police officer, the judge said, turn it over, photocopy it, turn it. So the attorney gets it. Attorney learns about it, and he said, oh, there are calibration printouts every day. It's used. I want the printouts. Kessler opposes it again. The guy said, I want those records. And the judge said, what's your argument? He goes, oh, it's confidential. You can't ask. And the judge's like, turn it over. And this guy smelled a rat. And he said, you know what? I want to know, Your Honor, when did they start using this particular machine? And Kessler said the year. And he said, I want every hold on, message. I want every calibration record since this has been used in Chittenden County for every DUI prosecution. And Kessler opposed that, and he said, oh, it's because, obviously I've read about this. Intimate with it. And he said, well, it's too complicated, it'd take forever. And the guy's like, I got all the time in the world. And the judge said, turn them over. Well, there were 30 some odd records that met this request. It's going to take a while, Your Honor. Well, take your time. So finally the day comes to go to court again, and they put this police officer, I don't know if it was Burlington or a state cop or Essex, but the cop's on the stand, sworn in, and he says to the police officer, asked him what happened, pulled the guy over, what'd you do? I breathalyzed him, he blew numbers, he exceeded the limit, so therefore I wrote him up, and that's why we're here. And he said, so what device did you use? I used a data master model, blah, blah, blah. And he said, so let me hand you Exhibit A. And he goes, what's that? He goes, that's a calibration record. He goes, what's the date of that? Whatever the date was. He goes, what's significant about that date? Well, that's the date your client got pulled over by me. So he said, so how do you go about calibrating the machine? And he's like, well, now you do this every day you're on shift. Every single day, right?
Yeah.
And he's been using it for years. 2 years, year and a half. How do you do it? Tell me how you do it. He goes, well, I don't have the manual in front of me. He goes, because I can tell you how to do it. It's pretty simple. I just read the manual, and I could tell you to do it. But I want you to tell me. He goes, well, I don't have the manual in front of me. It's like, okay. So there's the calibration record. There's the date. There's the time the calibration happened, 10 months ago. So is that a printout of the calibration record indicating when, the result you got the day you calibrated it? And he said, no. And the attorney goes, what, this isn't a calibration record? You said it was. Yeah, it is. And he said, is that the calibration record? It has your name. Oh, your name goes on it. It says you calibrated is your name. He goes, is that not your name? Yes, it is, sir. Does that not say you calibrated on that date at that time? It does, sir. Does it not say that machine was calibrated to standard? It does, sir. So why are you telling me that's not the record that you produced that day
Wow.
when you pulled my client over. And he said, I didn't calibrate it that day. Excuse me? I didn't calibrate it that day. Well, you just said that's a printout of the calibration. It says all this from a data master. It says that's your machine, that's your name. He goes, that's what it says. And it says that you did it. He goes, that's what it says. And he said, well, if you didn't calibrate it, where'd that come from? He goes, it was produced after the fact. Like when? Oh, I don't know. A few weeks ago. How could that be? What happened? He said, well, they have a technician that maintains these machines, and he reset the clocks. And he took my machine and reset the clock, and he ran a calibration as if it were on that date and time when I was coming on shift. So what you're telling me, this is a fraudulent record. This does not represent a calibration you did on the day my client was pulled over. And that machine would never calibrate it, which is required for it to be used in evidence in a court of law.
Yeah.
That's correct. So who did this? Well, a technician did. Who instructed the technician to do it? Who conspired to do this? And he goes, points across the courtroom. He did. Kessler. So then he says, I've got, 35 other calibration records from 35 other cases. Some involving other police officers, some involving you. Are those also fraudulent? That's my understanding. Those are all just produced for this court case. That's my understanding. And who had those produced? Gary Kessler did. So he should have been fired. He should have been prosecuted. He should have been put in jail. But this is how government works. He didn't get disbarred permanently.
That's why I think it's important you explain the whole thing.
They dropped all those prosecutions, got overturned.
Now they can use him for something.
But
too.
you can't. But this is what happens. So he worked under someone else. I'm going to leave the name out because I have a lot of regard for him. Probably wasn't paying attention to what Kessler was doing. And so Kessler had the goods on him. This is my conjecture at this point. And he was able to get that guy to give him a job at A&R. Why? Because that guy had become general counsel at A&R, and he got him this job. Well, ironically, the day this guy Kessler started at A&R as a lowly enforcement division attorney, this attorney for the enforcement division said, "Did you hear this? A new attorney got hired?" I'm like, "No, I don't know. I'm working. Come here, check it out." And we had a room where the photocopying machine was. It had all the newspapers and it had the Burlington Free Press above the crease. Deputy State's Attorney charged with contempt of court, sent to the bar, all this stuff. And they went through this whole case that I just explained to you what happened. And so here I am leaning at the paper. Holy shit. Who walks around the corner but the general counsel of A&R and this guy, Gary Kessler. And we're looking at it, and it says right on top.
Kessler.
Well, it didn't say Kessler. It said, state's
A&R,
attorney, deputy state's attorney, blah, blah, blah. And his name is in there. So here they hire a guy knowing he committed 36 counts of contempt of court, even if they just found that out that day, which they didn't because Kessler was working for this guy who's now his new boss. They knew about it, and this was a way they kind of protect their own. He got sanctioned at the bar. This came up in Kessler's deposition. Now, fast forward to my case. Kessler's deposition, and he got really unruly in that deposition. He never told the assistant AG that he created all these the fraudulent phone records, the fraudulent his history, because he's the attorney, he's the witness, he's the guy who wrote the author of the report that argued to fire me and created the grounds for my dismissal. He's the guy who had to defend a report on the stand. This guy's crazy. But he must have thought, oh, they'll just settle. Well, he's deposed, and he refused to answer questions. So my attorney, Norm Blay, said, Mr. Kessler, you can get nasty as you want, but you will answer my questions. One of the questions that he refused to answer was Deb Markowitz, did you have any conversations with her about Mr. Brabant in time with this investigation or prior? And he wouldn't answer that. And he started asking him some just around the edges. He didn't even talk about this case. He said, you're a state's attorney? Yeah. When did you come to work for A&R? Oh, I can't remember. Didn't remember anything. Sure. This guy could remember every single bike race stat or time, but he couldn't remember when he got hired. This monumental thing on a day that did anything happen to you? Well, no, I don't remember anything. And so he thought we didn't know, but of course we had all the records. And so Norm said, we're just going to tantalize them, because I don't think he would have told the AG, or this case wouldn't be going. We thought they were going to drop the case once they learned about Kessler. They didn't know. The assistant AG at the side of the table did not know, nor did her investigator. And he said, so we were sanctioned at the Vermont bar, and the only time, and he wouldn't answer, and she's like, answer? He's like, oh yeah, but I'm not now. He's like, oh, care to elaborate? And he got really crazy nasty, and he wouldn't answer any more questions. And Norm said, you know, these questions will be answered. You either answer them today, or we'll come back tomorrow. If you don't answer them tomorrow, we'll come back the next day. If it takes 5 years, we have a right to these questions being answered honestly while you're under oath, and you will answer them before we go to court. And so with that, the assistant AG said, let's take a bathroom break. 10-minute break, wound up being 45, 50 minutes. They come back, and this guy, you would have thought he was just released from the gulag. His head down, chin in his chest, looking down, and beat up. And so Norm's like, okay, so everyone took a bathroom break. Let's get back to the questions. And he answered every question. Oh, Deb Markowitz had met with him, and how many times? I don't know. More than 1? Yes. More than 10? Yes. More than 20? Yes. More than 30? Definitely. More than 40? Yeah, more than 40, but I don't know how many times more. When? Before there was even any issue of this guy having committed any, misconduct in his job? Yes. So what were the discussions? And then the Attorney General's Assistant AG said, was there counsel in the room? And Kessler said, I think so. Would have been John Groveman, and maybe counsel from the Human Resources Department. And he said, I'm not sure, I think so. And she said, that's private attorney-client privilege. So, but our attorney said, we don't need to know anymore. But clearly in the intervening 50 minutes when they took a break, Kessler told her about what happened, the Assistant AG. So there are many things I'll leave out, but that was a very wonderful day in deposition. They deposed me after him for 8.5 hours. A lowly state employee, which is what the report said, who thinks so highly of the guy in the mirror that he thinks the governor even knows his name or cares about him, even though I had the governor's cell phone number.
Yeah.
Even though I met with the governor's counsel, they wanted to settle. And the gag order, and I wouldn't do it. And so Norm Belay said, well, they're not going to settle unless you get the gag order. I said, we had him connecting Markowitz, and now this gets to Phil Scott, who I think walks on water. I've always thought very highly of him. We didn't always agree on every political issue, but he cares about people.
Thank God you didn't Vermonters. You didn't agree on every single issue.
Yeah. And you know what? I consider him the most honorable person. He's another one of these old school Vermont, salt of the earth Vermonters who they don't exist anymore. Yep. And whether they were Democrats, he behaves exactly like the old Democrats used to behave. He behaves like the old Republicans used to be in Vermont.
Yeah.
And he's not anomalous. He's very much mainstream Vermont. And it's interesting. You will not see the Vermont Democratic Party assailing him vehemently. And I always say, and I say this to people in leadership, and they all agree when there's no one around. For all the things you complain about Phil Scott for, if he were a Democrat, and you might consider him a conservative Democrat or a moderate Democrat, you'd be lauding all the things he did well and did right by you.
Yeah.
And everything he disagreed with you on, you wouldn't be talking about. Because there's 5 of those, and there's 75 or 175 things that he signs into law that you agree on. And interesting, Jill Kowinski came out with a thing like, "Oh, I really appreciate the governor, his collaborative nature," and we just did you read that last week?
I don't know. Was it about how he didn't show up and that's what they're mad about, or
yeah, I think it ended with that. But she
the fact that he didn't show up for the meeting.
I don't think it was a show up. It had to do with him vetoing some things. And she said, we place a higher priority on climate, and we think it's more serious than he takes seriously. But she starts out by saying how good he is, because she knows he gets 80% of the vote, and most are Democrats.
83% approval rating.
83% approval rating. So she can't assail him.
No.
At her peril.
Politically, it's not valuable.
She both praises him and then, is critical of these things, which is, that's not how they behave in the State House.
No, they hate him,
as we know. So Phil Scott. So I get fired. The appeal's going on, and this is when I'm being deposed, and Gary Kessler's other witnesses are being deposed. I'm working I get a job with the Vermont State Employees Union as a union rep, field rep, representing employees. And I'm in my office working late as usual, and someone turns out the light. I'm on the 3rd floor, and I'm like, whoa, I'm up here working. And it's the executive director, Mark Mitchell, and I said, whoa, hey, Mark. He's like, oh, he's got this cigarette smoker by Brabant. What are you doing up there? And as I'm working, Mark, working, doing what I need to do. And he goes, why aren't you at the State House? There's the governor's meet and greet after the second election. He didn't have inaugural dinner or party that time because, Vermonters are hurting. So we got to be pulling our belts. And I shouldn't be celebrating when people are suffering. That's what Shumlin said. But come and greet me on the well of the house. Don't you want to go there? And I'm like, no, I don't want to go there. The guy just fired me a month ago. And by the way, Shumlin waited, despite them finishing this case and everything against me. He put me on leave, costing taxpayers money because they're paying me, until the day after the election. Then he fires me because he was afraid I was going to come out
before the election.
And, he knew he was already starting to catch. Yeah, totally. This thing is so politicized. It's unbelievable. So I said, Mark, I don't want to go there. He goes, don't you want to shake his hand and look him in the eye? Let me get my coat. I'll be right down. So he grabs the union photographer. We walk up to the State House, and there's this procession of people. And it's Shumlin and a couple of his staff members as I'm looking up to the front of the well of the house. And then to Shumlin's left is Shap Smith, who was Speaker of the House at the time, and his wife. And then to Shap's left, kind of at a 90, is Lieutenant Governor Phil Scott, having just been reelected, and his wife, Diane. So I come in, and we're getting closer, and Shumlin's like, oh, he's all nice and happy. And then he sees me, and he's like not paying attention to people who are shaking his hand. His eyes are going he's getting all weird and nervous body language.
Oh, yeah.
Totally weirding out. And I don't know if it was because the union camera guy was there and Mark Mitchell was there, who was clearly his nemesis because Mark was always attacking him. But probably the combination of all three of us.
Mark Mitchell of who?
He was the executive director of the Vermont State Employees Union at the time.
Okay.
So I finally get to him, and, Shumlin knew I raised beef cattle and hay and used to run past my farm and, hung out in Adamant Village where the co-op is all the time, where I was, it's where my post office is, as well as his post office box. And he's like, I'm like, Governor, congratulations. And he pulls me next to him. He's like, how's it going? How's it going? And I'm like, not well. What do you mean? Pulls me in again. And I'm like, well, your administration just fired me last month. I gave him enough distance so he could, plausible deniability. He's like, oh, I didn't know. He's all nervous. He couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't know. And I was waiting for him to say, well, if you didn't know, then you can give me my job back. You have ultimately authority. I said, well, it's all on fake, trumped up charges. I would have thought you'd know. Oh, I didn't know. He's like, how are the beefers? How are the beef cattle? And I said, they're all up for sale. He goes, oh, you're not raising beef cattle? I'm like, no, the farm's for sale. I'm going to lose my house. I've lost my job. It's just little drama. And he's like, oh. And I said, so I just want to let you know that. So anything you can do to help me, I'll look into it. I'm like, I'm sure you will. But don't let this bother you. This is your day. Enjoy your day, Governor. So I walk over to Shap, and Shap goes, "Hey, did you hear about this water quality initiative we're pushing through?" And he goes, "Oh no, wait, you run the salvage yard program." I'm like, "No, I don't."
I did.
He goes, "Yes, you do." And he goes, "No." I said, "No, I don't." And he goes, "Oh God, John, I'm sorry. I thought you ran a salvage yard program." I'm sorry. I said, "Oh, I did, but your buddy over there just fired me." And I got to say, I didn't think Shap loved me or hated me. We had a relationship, but his whole demeanor changed and his color changed, and I felt really good. I mean, he and I have had our battles, but I felt like that was some respect for me. I felt good that he cared.
Like he was actually like,
and he goes, "I'm really sorry." And I said, "Don't worry, I got this." He goes, "I'm sure you do."
Yeah.
So then we go over to Phil. Now I ran the salvage yard program. Phil's a motor guy.
Yep.
Phil's a car guy.
Yep.
Phil knows all the salvage yard guys, the Bulldogs.
That's right.
He knows them, and I regulated all them. And I worked with Phil when he was we passed this change to the law to better regulate, get our arms around regulating salvage yards. I was the witness, and I had drafted a legislation. I was lobbying for it under the Douglas administration. And Phil called me. I remember on my cell. I was out in the field working, inspecting salvage yards, and he asked me about this provision in the law, and I walked him through. He goes, "Well, this is a concern of mine." And I said, "Well, you could fix it by changing this language." And he put amendment in and changed it. That concern, I said, "It's not really a concern, but if you want to dot the I's and cross the T's, you could put this language in." He goes, "Thanks." So he was a senator then, became lieutenant governor when the law came in place. So I go up to him, and he's with Diane, and he's like, his head down. He goes, "How's it going?" And I said, "Well, not great. I don't know if you heard." And I shook my head towards Shum, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I know. Because my phone's ringing up the hook. I'm getting emails, and I know everything." And I was like, "Really?" He goes, "I know a lot." He said, he gave me his card, and he said, I think her name was Rachel, who was office manager then. "Call Rachel, set up an appointment. We need to talk." So she scheduled 45 minutes, an hour and a half later, 45 minutes later, we get out. And the long and short of it is, before there was anything, someone had just taken office, but because of my meeting with Beth Robinson and all this stuff, the flood happened in 2011.
Yep.
And so Phil Scott and Peter Shumlin, lieutenant governor and governor, were driving around in the state car visiting all these impacted trailer parks and other sites, downtowns. And so Phil said they had like a van or something that would follow, and they'd set up a podium and a sound speaker system, and Shumlin would speak, and he goes, you wouldn't believe this guy. He'd put his heart on his sleeve, and people would be crying, "I'm there for you, and I'll bring home whatever aid you can, and I'll fight, and you're in my heart and on my mind, and all this stuff that's not right." And Phil's like, "I had to follow this guy," and Phil was like, "Yeah, I agree with the guy." He's like, he the way he expressed himself, he's such a salesman. And he said, they'd pack up the podium and the sound system. We get back in our car, the entourage would follow, and he said, we get back in the car, he goes, "Someone will be driving." And he goes, "Okay, where were we now?" "Oh yeah, Brabant, effing Brabant. That guy, I'm going to fire him. He's a pain in my ass." And Phil never told him that he and I had a good relationship.
And there he was.
And we weren't besties, but we had a very good, long relationship. And he said, "You wouldn't believe the stuff he said." So he started telling me all about this. And I said, "Phil, I really appreciate this. Doesn't surprise me. But it doesn't do me any good. I can't use this in court because it's all hearsay.
Sure.
Unless you were to go on the stand." And he said, "Subpoena me, and I'll go on the stand." So, lieutenant governor. And so when we put together our witness list, and we had reporters, we had agency officials, we had this guy Kessler. Now we put Markowitz, we put Shumlin on it because of Phil. I had a direct tie to him and his involvement before there were any assertions of improper conduct. because it was all dated before.
Yeah.
Because the personnel action only started officially, according to the record they created, this faux record in 2012.
I see.
Irene was 2011.
So it was before that this guy
so
had
we
an
had
issue
him.
with you.
Yeah. Well, officially, they were doing it as soon as they got in office,
Yeah.
building this, trying to figure out what to do.
I can't imagine.
Irene screwed them up. Irene screwed them up, so they had to restart it for whatever reason.
It's being the governor, though, and like that's the game that you're playing. It's just like it's got to be so just and terrible and stressful, and like you're doing that with you. Imagine the number of people that they're doing this type of stuff.
But think of that, a governor or a lieutenant governor willing to do that for me. You know, and that's emblematic of how he is.
It is.
He'd do it for any Vermonter.
He would.
Because he's not a fan of impropriety or corrupt government or, that's my everyday experience with the guy.
He loves this state.
And, I said to Norm, my attorney, he said, we're going to go to court. And I said, think about it, Norm. If you were counsel advising your client, would you allow Gary Kessler, who had committed contempt of court 30 some odd times, got sanctioned at the bar, and his license suspended for God knows how long. Would you want Markowitz on the stand, who now has to explain her behavior, and then we can bring up her history at the Secretary of State's office? Would you want Peter Shumlin on the governor? The highest level official in state government. It ain't happening. And I said, I'll get a settlement without a gag order, and I did.
Good.
I did. So, so that's what happened, and that's,
that's quite the story.
Yeah, it's both wonderful, horrific, and wonderful.
Well, and I think that's the point. Is it just shows you, even here in Vermont, at a state level, we do have a ton of corruption, ton of just bad.
It's human nature.
It is bad actors, bad players, but then there's also really good people out there.
That's right.
Still looking out for the everyday man and trying to make sure that the right thing is done.
So the agenda is, Paul, knowing that there are all these good people, 83% approval rating.
Yeah.
They don't care what political stripe you're under. The supermajority in power knows this.
Yeah.
So how do you keep them on your side? If everybody knows the facts about everything they do, there's some stuff where they can easily sell it, to this public who supports Phil, even though Phil vetoed it or didn't sign it. It's an easy sell. They're proud. We just agree to disagree. It's because we care about people. They can market it as that, housing or whatever, school budgets or something. But, this renewable energy scam, all the covering up of numbers, the disregarding of the Department of Public Service numbers, those people at the DPS, who does this super majority, how do you think they vote? I'll bet you to a number they vote Democratic. Ticket.
Of course,
it's
like, of course.
You look at how few, and yet these people are being disparaged by legislators ongoing, derided on the floor of the Senate. Avram Pat derided DPS officials. He was disappointed in them. I mean, didn't excoriate them, but he said, I'm very disappointed in how they behaved and how they're reporting, as if what they said was fraudulent or, extremely biased against the planet and the environment and the people. It's just, the partisanship it's
incredible.
Reached incredible heights. Yep. And, we need to somehow turn this around. And the way we do it is getting all the facts on the table, which they're trying to obscure, because when they're on the table, regular Vermonters are not going to have it. And they know it.
Yeah, they do. People. Well, I think the point is people are starting to pick up on it. That's from what I understand.
They totally are.
And Phil, from the beginning of this legislature, has been very clear. I'm not just talking about getting Republicans elected, because as we've talked about throughout this entirety of the show, is that these phrases and terms and everything, they don't really mean anything anymore. And back to your point too about some of these more environmentally sound Republicans that held office in the late 80s through 2000s. It sounds like
Dick McCormick is one of the last, but he's just surrounded by these people, and he just goes with the flow.
Actually, Phil just tweeted out, somebody just sent this to me, Vermonters simply cannot afford the supermajority in the legislature. Over the past 2 years, they've passed a historic property tax hike, created a new payroll tax, passed bills that will increase electric and home heating costs, and more. I need your help electing moderates. And I think that's probably a good place for us to...
And I've had direct conversations with the governor about this.
You know, he's putting in the fight, and I think that a lot of us want to see it happen, and we just got to keep having conversations like these. I'm going to promote this conversation because, you know, I just want to say to anybody out there who regularly watches and you're just thinking, geez, these guys went on forever today. Well, this is really important stuff. These conversations need to be had, and everything needs to be aired out, because I think, you know, Timothy Page, I can't see your chat anymore, but he wrote in, gee, imagine knowing that a certain percentage of Vermonters don't even realize that the governor's vetoes can be overridden. And I'm sure they don't know anything about this. And it's like, yeah they don't, because nobody, has the time to dive in, and nobody's willing to take the time to put it out there. So we have to continue to do that. And
how many Vermonters know that Charity Clark, I mean, it was printed in Vermont Digger and 7 Days and other publications, Vermont Daily Chronicle, that Charity Clark settled using taxpayer money, $16+ million, to pay off people that the state of Vermont screwed under the Shumlin administration, under the EB-5 program.
I didn't even know that. And actually, that was somebody just wrote that in, and I can't see their chat anymore.
It's outrageous.
Somebody ask John if he knows anything about the EB-5 scandal. But I want to keep going, but I have to go. I know.
To be continued. I would encourage you, Paul, to invite Ann Galloway.
Okay.
I don't know how full time she is at Vermont Digger, but she's the one that got the story out, and she is as neutral. She's an old school journalist, and she's the kind of person that you should interview. And she knows the EB-5 scandal inside and out. She can cite chapter and verse, every detail of it. So I would encourage you to interview Ann Galloway. I would encourage Guy at the Vermont Daily Chronicle to, if you can, do an interview with Ann Galloway, or summarize your interview with her if you're fortunate enough to get interviewed.
Sure.
She lives up in Hardwick. Not too hard to find.
See if I can get a hold of her at some point. But let's wrap this up, John. I just want to say thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Maybe you learned something. I know I certainly have learned a lot today, almost too much in some ways. No, just kidding. But I just want to thank you again, John, for coming down here.
Sure,
do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap it up?
Thank you for doing this. This is great. And one last call out to the Vermont Daily Chronicle. There are definitely very conservative voices that are on there, which, you know, I'll put it right out there. I agree with a lot, and I disagree with a lot.
Yep.
But Guy Page is amazing. He does not screen opinion pieces for their political coloration. He does not limit news to one perspective or another. He's everything that's fit to print, he will print. And this has got them worried. And I think it's going to force 7 Days and VT Digger to operate at a higher level, because if they don't print it, he's going to print it. And it can be the most lefty, far left opinion piece ever to come to Vermont, and he'll print it and let the chips fall where they may, and also the other way. So support Vermont Daily Chronicle and their good work. Paul works with them.
Thank you. That means a lot.
It's essential. They're the only publication that I can honestly say is fully open to hearing all Vermonters' opinions.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John, Guy, and I'm sure Guy is out there listening and he appreciates it. So thank you, everybody. This has been Creemee Cast.